The modern conception of time appears immovable and indisputable, embedded into daily life with atomic precision. Yet beneath this apparent certainty lies a centuries-old architecture of invention, negotiation, and imposition. Timekeeping, far from being a passive reflection of cosmic order, is a historically contingent system shaped by political, religious, and cultural forces. This section begins the investigation by dismantling the presumption of time as a neutral metric and introduces the possibility that what we call historical chronology may in fact be a consensus manufactured by elite authorities. Before the development of mechanical clocks and universal calendars, human societies used natural cycles to mark time. Lunar phases, solar solstices, harvests, and migrations all formed the temporal scaffolding of early civilizations. However, these rhythms varied significantly across regions, leading to temporal pluralism. The Sumerians divided the day into 12 parts. The Egyptians counted decades in groups of 10 years, known as decades, while the Mesoamerican long count calendar operated on entirely different cosmic assumptions. The multiplicity of these systems undermines the idea that there exists a single objective chronology for all human activity. Instead, what emerges is a multiplicity of temporal worldviews. This pluralism posed a challenge as empires expanded and sought to administrate over increasingly diverse populations. Coordination of agriculture, taxation, military campaigns, and religious festivals necessitated standardized timekeeping. But this standardization did not arise through organic consensus. It was often imposed through decree, embedded within systems of power. The political decision to adopt a single calendar over another frequently reflected the dominant ideology, not astronomical precision. This is a critical distinction. Timekeeping evolved not merely to reflect the stars, but to serve terrestrial agendas. Roman adoption of the Julian calendar is a case in point. Implemented under Julius Caesar in 45 BCE and designed with the aid of Egyptian astronomers, the Julian calendar replaced the chaotic Roman Republican system. This change was less about correcting scientific inaccuracies than asserting imperial control. Calendar reform served to stabilize political power, unify the empire under a common framework, and align civic events with the cult of the emperor. Thus, from its inception, the Western calendar tradition was not simply a scientific innovation, but a political instrument. Over the centuries, this instrument would be sharpened by institutions claiming divine sanction. As Christianity spread through Europe, ecclesiastical authorities became the custodians of time. The Church determined the liturgical year, declared feast days, and calculated Easter through complex computus algorithms. These measures effectively subordinated cosmic time to theological narrative. Linear, salvationist chronology replaced cyclical pagan festivals. The past was reordered through a Christian lens, beginning not with the dawn of writing or the rise of empires, but with creation as narrated in Genesis. Time was not only standardized, it was sanctified. Yet the sanctification of time did not occur without contradiction. Throughout the Middle Ages, discrepancies accumulated. By the 16th century, the Julian calendar was out of sync with the solar year by approximately 10 days. Equinoxes drifted, agricultural cycles misaligned, and Easter fell increasingly out of phase with Passover. Calls for reform grew louder, but reform posed a threat to those who controlled the calendar. To tamper with chronology was to risk unsettling the theological and political order it underpinned. The Gregorian reform of 1582 would be the most visible assertion of calendar control. Pope Gregory XIII's adjustment skipping 10 days and instituting new leap year rules was officially presented as a scientific correction. But the surrounding context raises questions. Why was the reform necessary precisely at that historical juncture? Why did certain regions refuse to accept it for centuries? Why was it enforced through papal bull rather than open scholarly consensus? These questions suggest that calendar reform was not merely about aligning with the stars, but about reasserting institutional authority over the measurement of time itself. This raises a more unsettling possibility. If calendar systems can be adjusted by decree, how secure is our trust in the chronology they produce? If 10 days can be deleted in 1582, could centuries be inserted or erased elsewhere? The guardianship of time by centralized authorities opens the door to manipulation. Once chronology becomes a matter of consensus rather than empiricism, it becomes vulnerable to political construction. Furthermore, the integration of timekeeping with historiography compounds this issue. Historical dates are anchored in calendar systems. Change the system, and the timeline shifts. The rise and fall of empires, the births and deaths of rulers, the sequencing of events, all become subject to the stability of the underlying chronological framework. If that framework is flawed, everything built upon it becomes questionable. This foundational uncertainty is rarely addressed in mainstream historiography. Chronology is often treated as settled fact, the stable backdrop against which human events unfold. But in truth, chronology is a fragile edifice, reliant on the coherence of manuscripts, the integrity of source materials, and the consensus of a scholarly elite. Competing chronologies have existed for centuries, yet dominant narratives suppress them. The persistence of dissenting timelines, from Byzantine to Islamic to Ethiopian systems, attests to this contested terrain. Why have these systems been marginalized? What does it reveal about the politics of temporal authority? The notion that time is a neutral metric crumbles under scrutiny. Timekeeping is and always has been a contested domain. Whether by emperors seeking legitimacy, popes asserting theological dominance, or modern institutions establishing global standards, the control of time is a strategic imperative. To define the year is to define the epoch. To mark the calendar is to mark civilization itself. This investigation begins with the premise that time as we know is not a passive reflection of celestial mechanics, but a constructed consensus, vulnerable to distortion. In the sections that follow, this script will pursue the lineage of that distortion. From Scaliger's chronology to papal edicts, from fabricated centuries to erased rulers, the narrative of time will be dissected as a political project. Each section will examine a layer of this construction, questioning the institutions and assumptions that uphold it. The aim is not to deny history, but to interrogate its scaffolding. What if time is not what we believe it to be? And if not, who has shaped that belief, and to what end? The figure most central to the consolidation of historical chronology in the early modern period is Joseph Justus Scaliger, a name largely unknown to the public, yet foundational to the academic ordering of time. Born in 1540 to the renowned Italian scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger, Joseph emerged during a period of intellectual turmoil, an era attempting to reconcile classical antiquity, biblical texts, and medieval traditions within an increasingly skeptical and empirical worldview. His contributions, while presented as scholarly systematization, established an authoritative framework for chronology that persists to this day. This section scrutinizes Scaliger's role in constructing the chronological backbone of Western historiography and raises critical questions about the legitimacy and methodological foundations of his work. Scaliger's most influential publication, De Emendation Temporum 1583, aimed to correct and unify the diverse chronological systems of ancient civilizations. In this ambitious project, Scaliger attempted to create a comparative matrix, aligning events from the Jewish, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Christian calendars into a single unified timeline. At the heart of this effort was his introduction of the Julian period, a 7,980-year cycle designed to harmonize the solar, lunar, and indiction cycles. This artificial temporal container would allow historians to reference all dates against a supposedly neutral baseline, thereby solving chronological discrepancies across cultures and texts. However, the construction of this universal chronology required more than mathematical ingenuity. It demanded interpretive authority over texts, translations, and fragmentary records. Scaliger leaned heavily on classical sources, many of which were already centuries removed from the events they purported to describe. He also made extensive use of the Bible, treating genealogies and symbolic numbers as literal chronological indicators. In practice, this meant that a timeline derived partly from religious myth was given equivalence with imperial records and astronomical events. The resulting synthesis was presented as scientific, despite its theological and speculative foundations. Scaliger's methods, while couched in scholarly rigor, involved considerable conjecture, lacking archaeological evidence or independent dating. Technologies. He relied on synchronization, aligning events from disparate sources based on perceived parallels or textual hints. These assumptions, once codified, became immovable reference points. For example, he anchored the fall of Troy at 1184 BCE and constructed backward and forward linkages from that date. Yet this date is not derived from material evidence but from interpretations of literary chronology, particularly those of Eratosthenes and Eusebius, whose own sources were far from empirical. Moreover, Scaliger's framework was rapidly adopted not merely for its perceived accuracy, but for its utility. The Catholic Church, Protestant reformers, and emerging secular historians found in his chronology a usable infrastructure. It allowed the Church to reconcile biblical history with classical antiquity, thereby defending the historical integrity of Scripture. For secular scholars, it offered a seemingly objective method of ordering the past, removing the burden of theological validation. The rapid institutional acceptance of Scaliger's model suggests that its ideological compatibility may have been as significant as its intellectual merit. The influence of Scaliger extended well beyond his lifetime. His chronological system became the backbone for subsequent historians, such as Dionysius Petavius, and was later integrated into the scientific advances of the Enlightenment. Even Isaac Newton, in his Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, engaged directly with the Scaligerian timeline, attempting to compress or adjust it without rejecting its underlying framework. This continuity reveals how deeply embedded Scaliger's chronology became in the collective historical imagination. Once installed, it proved remarkably resilient to critique or revision. Yet modern scrutiny reveals profound limitations in Scaliger's project. Archaeology, radiocarbon dating, and comparative historiography have exposed inconsistencies and anomalies in the traditional timeline. Entire periods, especially in early medieval Europe, suffer from documentary silence, inconsistent source material, or overlapping reigns that suggest either erroneous duplication or fabrication. Attempts to resolve these anomalies are often constrained by the very chronology that Scaliger helped institutionalize. Because his framework serves as the baseline, challenges to it are frequently dismissed as fringe or revisionist. Regardless of their evidentiary basis, the situation leads to a critical, epistemological problem. How does one question a system that has become the condition for all historical inquiry? If chronology functions as the operating system of historiography, then all data must be rendered legible within its parameters. Dissenting timelines, unaligned artifacts, and non-Western chronologies are marginalized or forcibly reconciled with the dominant schema. Scaliger's model, while originally a tool of synthesis, has become a mechanism of exclusion. The implications extend beyond academic debate. Public understanding of history taught in schools, represented in museums, and embedded in national narratives derives from this scaffolding. When individuals think of the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, or the Renaissance, They are unwittingly referencing dates and sequences built atop Scaliger's model. This naturalizes the chronology, rendering it invisible and incontestable. Yet the very effort to unify time, to flatten complex and contradictory temporalities into a single linear sequence, is an act of narrative control. Furthermore, the philosophical implications are significant. If history is not merely a sequence of events, but a function of how we order and interpret those events, then chronology is not a neutral medium, but a narrative device. Scaliger's work did not merely catalog time, it authored it. The authority to define when things happened entails the power to define what those things mean. When and where history begins, when a civilization falls, or when a dark age ends, these are not empirically derived facts but interpretive assertions. Embedded in a constructed chronology, what emerges then is a deeply paradoxical legacy. Scaliger's effort was born of a desire to impose order on historical chaos, to render the past coherent and comprehensible. In doing so, he provided a foundation for modern historiography. But that foundation is not neutral. It is layered with theological presupposition, cultural biases, and interpretive leaps. Its universalism conceals its partiality. Its authority masks its contingency. And its resilience makes it difficult to challenge, even when confronted with contradictory evidence. This investigation must therefore treat Scaliger not merely as a historical figure, but as an architect of epistemological infrastructure. His chronology is not a reflection of historical truth, but a construct that shaped how truth itself is measured. The question is not whether Scaliger falsified history, but whether the system he built precludes the recognition of histories that do not conform to it. As the investigation continues, it will become necessary to explore how this constructed system intersected with institutional power, especially in its alliance with the Church and state, and whether it enabled a larger project of historical domestication. The Julian calendar, implemented in 45 BCE under the direction of Julius Caesar, is often portrayed as a rational leap forward in timekeeping. It replaced a chaotic and inconsistent Roman lunar calendar with a solar-based system meant to mirror the Egyptian model. However, the standard historical narrative obscures the political motives and ideological implications behind this reform. Far from being a purely scientific adjustment, the introduction of the Julian calendar represented a consolidation of imperial control and a redefinition of time as an administrative instrument. It created not only a more regular calendar, but a more governable society. The Roman Republic's calendar prior to Caesar was notoriously unreliable. It consisted of a lunar framework with periodic intercalary months, inserted or omitted based on decisions by the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priestly office. These decisions were routinely manipulated for political ends. Ambitious magistrates could extend their terms or delay rivals by arbitrarily modifying the calendar. The result was a system where time itself became a tool of factional conflict. Rather than stabilizing civic life, the calendar intensified Rome's structural instability. Julius Caesar's reform thus cannot be separated from his broader campaign to impose order on a disintegrating republic. Having acquired dictatorial powers, Caesar sought to regularize time and remove its manipulation from priestly hands. By aligning Rome's calendar with the Egyptian solar system, 365 days, with a leap year every fourth, he removed discretion from the calendar and relocated control to the imperial state. The naming of the month July after himself further signaled that time had been repoliticized under a new regime. Calendar reform became a statement of legitimacy, asserting that Caesar, not the Senate or religious authorities, governed time. The political nature of the Julian calendar is further revealed in its adoption across the empire. Implementing a new calendar involved more than issuing a decree. It required the reorganization of time across an expansive and diverse territory. Local systems of timekeeping, often based on agricultural or religious cycles, had to be replaced. or subordinated. This demanded not just coordination, but enforcement. The calendar reform functioned as an early tool of imperial synchronization, aligning peripheral regions with the temporal rhythm of Rome. It was not simply about correcting lunar drift, but about asserting a unified imperial identity. However, the Julian calendar was not as precise as it claimed. Its calculation of 365.25 days per year exceeded the true solar year by approximately 11 minutes. Over centuries, this discrepancy accumulated, resulting in significant drift between calendar dates and celestial events. By the time of the 16th century, the calendar had shifted 10 full days from the astronomical equinox. This drift was not merely a technical issue. It posed theological challenges, particularly regarding the dating of Easter and other movable feasts dependent on solar cycles. The Church, which had adopted the Julian system for liturgical purposes, found itself increasingly at odds with the heavens. This divergence opened a space for new forms of temporal authority to emerge. If the calendar was inaccurate, it could no longer claim divine alignment. If it was malleable, then the question arose, who had the authority to correct it? The Julian system, having once served as a vehicle of imperial legitimacy, now threatened the credibility of ecclesiastical timekeeping. Reforming it would require more than astronomical expertise. It would necessitate an institutional mandate to redefine time for all of Christendom. The political complications were vast. Adjusting the calendar would invalidate feast days, challenge established chronologies, and potentially undermine the credibility of centuries of ecclesiastical documentation. Opposition was immediate and multifaceted. Some feared the disruption of tradition. Others saw an opportunity to assert new control. Within this contentious climate, calendar reform became a deeply political issue, entangled with questions of papal supremacy, national sovereignty, and theological orthodoxy. The calendar was also a temporal map upon which historical narratives were inscribed. Kings reigned, saints died, councils convened, all according to dates fixed within the Julian schema. Altering the calendar threatened to destabilize these reference points. Chronological coherence, central to the legitimacy of both church and state, depended on a fixed structure of time. Reform could be seen as necessary for accuracy, but also as dangerous for the stories it might unwrite or revise. The Julian calendar, thus, functioned for centuries as both a convenience and a constraint. It enabled the spread of coordinated time across Europe and the Mediterranean, yet it locked historical events into a flawed framework. The accumulation of error did not merely shift the dates of solstices. It called into question the epistemological foundations of historical time. If one of the most basic and foundational tools for marking the past was flawed, then the integrity of the historical narrative was subject to doubt. This context reveals the dual role of calendars. They are both practical instruments and ideological apparatuses. The Julian calendar was not simply a step in the evolution of timekeeping. It was a political tool deployed to assert dominance and foster unity within an expanding empire. Its eventual obsolescence did not arise purely from empirical inadequacy, but from the growing mismatch between its ideological utility and empirical reality. The need for reform emerged not from a desire for precision alone, but from a crisis of legitimacy. Understanding this duality is essential for the broader investigation into the manipulation of chronology. It sets a precedent. If calendars can be created and altered by decree, then so too can historical time be manufactured to align with institutional interests. The Julian calendar's drift may have been a scientific flaw, but its long-term retention was an institutional decision. It reveals how systems of timekeeping persist, not because they are correct, but because they serve entrenched power structures. The transition from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar would attempt to rectify these errors, but in doing so, it would also reassert central authority over time. That transition, far from being a neutral scientific event, would become one of the most contested reforms in Western history. It would divide nations, splinter religious traditions, and introduce the possibility that chronology itself was open to fabrication. The next phase of this investigation must focus on that transition and the institutional mechanisms that orchestrated it. The Gregorian calendar. Reform of 1582 is often portrayed as a corrective measure, an effort to realign civil time with celestial events, particularly the spring equinox. Officially initiated by Pope Gregory XIII through the papal bull Inter Gravissimas, the reform is remembered for excising 10 days from the calendar and introducing revised leap year rules to halt further drift. However, the reform was not merely a response to astronomical misalignment. It was a calculated intervention into the fabric of temporal authority, driven by theological imperatives, political consolidation, and the strategic assertion of papal jurisdiction over the measurement of time. By the late 16th century, the Julian calendar had deviated so far from the solar year that the spring equinox integral to calculating the date of Easter was falling on March 11 rather than March 21st. This misalignment undermined the Church's ability to maintain a coherent liturgical cycle, as the date of Easter depended on the equinox and the lunar calendar. A temporal rupture had emerged between the institutional calendar and the natural order it purported to reflect. Yet correcting this rupture required more than scientific recalibration. It necessitated an act of authoritative redefinition. Gregorian reform was designed by a commission led by the Jesuit mathematician and astronomer Christopher Clavius. Its central elements included skipping 10 days to restore the equinox to March 21st, altering the rule for leap years by omitting 3 leap days every 400 years, and introducing a new formula for calculating Easter. These changes, while mathematically sound, did not exist in a political vacuum. Implementing them involved overriding centuries of ecclesiastical documentation, undermining existing national traditions, and asserting papal supremacy over time itself. The fact that the reform came in the form of a papal bull is significant. Rather than being proposed through an international scientific council or a secular institution, the change was issued as a decree from the Vatican. This reveals the underlying power dynamics. The Church did not merely want to fix the calendar, it wanted to reassert its role as the ultimate arbiter of time. The temporal crisis presented an opportunity to centralize authority, reaffirm doctrinal control, and suppress local calendrical traditions that might threaten ecclesiastical uniformity. Reaction to the reform exposes its geopolitical fault lines. Catholic countries such as Italy, Spain, Portugal, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth adopted the new calendar immediately. Protestant and Orthodox regions, however, resisted. England did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, and Orthodox nations like Russia held out until the 20th century. This resistance was not based on astronomical disagreement, but on suspicion of papal overreach. Timekeeping had become a battleground for religious and national sovereignty. The 10-day deletion, moving from October 4th to October 15th overnight, was not merely an adjustment of counting. It raised profound questions about the continuity of time. If 10 days could be erased by decree, what prevented authorities from altering other portions of the calendar, or even inserting time that had never occurred? Critics at the time questioned the metaphysical implications of erasing days from history. Birthdays, anniversaries, debts, contracts, and legal deadlines were suddenly disrupted. The idea that time itself could be edited so drastically undermined its perceived objectivity and neutrality. The leap year rule revisions also had broader implications. By reducing the number of leap years, the Gregorian calendar introduced an irregularity that complicated traditional computations. More importantly, it implied that even the smallest units of civil time were subject to institutional control. The reform embedded ecclesiastical logic into the deepest layers of temporal structure. It demonstrated that even supposedly mathematical decisions could reflect ideological motives. The reform also strategically obscured its dependence on biblical and theological assumptions. While presented as a scientific correction, the reform was fundamentally driven by the need to preserve the credibility of Easter, an ecclesiastical event with no direct astronomical counterpart. This necessity anchored the entire calendar to Christian liturgical needs, reinforcing the fusion of theology and timekeeping. The reform did not return time to nature, it subordinated nature to religious doctrine, under the guise of scientific rationality. Further complicating the issue was the secrecy surrounding the Vatican's astronomical calculations. The methods and data used by Clavius and his team were not made publicly verifiable. This lack of transparency fostered long-term distrust. Critics pointed out that the Church was asking the world to accept a radical revision of time on its word alone. The epistemological foundations of the Reform, empirical observation, theological necessity, institutional fiat were blurred. This ambiguity granted the Vatican flexibility, but at the cost of credibility. Even centuries later, the Gregorian Reform continues to shape how the world experiences time. The calendar is now so deeply entrenched in global infrastructure that it is difficult to imagine alternatives. Its dominance over business, law, education, and international coordination ensures its permanence. But this permanence conceals its origins as a power maneuver. What began as a politically motivated ecclesiastical intervention has become an invisible standard, naturalized and universalized without scrutiny. The Gregorian calendar's endurance illustrates how temporal structures, once imposed, become invisible. They cease to appear as inventions and instead appear as inevitabilities. The calendar becomes part of the world's fabric, not its fabrication. Yet every component, the month lengths, the leap year cycle, the fixed date of Easter, is a product of deliberate design. The Reform redefined not only the measurement of days, but the historical continuity that undergirds social memory. It silently altered the chronology upon which centuries of historical understanding are built. This has consequences for the historical record. Documents predating the Reform must be recalibrated, leading to discrepancies and ambiguities in dating. Historians must account for two calendars when reconstructing past events, the Julian and the Gregorian. This duality introduces uncertainty into timelines, particularly in the early modern period. In many cases, this has resulted in contradictions, overlapping dates, or artificially compressed sequences of events. The transition did not simply align time. It fragmented it. Ultimately, the Gregorian intervention reveals a pattern that will recur throughout this investigation. Time is not corrected, it is curated. Its structure reflects the priorities and fears of those who define it. The Reform was not just about returning Easter to the proper season. It was about restoring the authority of institutions under threat. In doing so, it institutionalized the idea that time could be managed from above, reshaped according to ideological or administrative needs. As this inquiry progresses, it becomes necessary to ask whether the Gregorian Reform was the most visible expression of a deeper phenomenon, the manipulation of historical time to suit narrative coherence. Could the Reform be a mask for deeper chronological rearrangements? If 10 days can be erased openly, what prevents centuries from being inserted quietly? The next section will confront one of the most controversial implications of such reasoning. The phantom time hypothesis. The phantom time hypothesis presents one of the most radical challenges to established chronology in modern historiography. Formulated primarily by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s, the hypothesis asserts that a period of approximately 297 years specifically the years between 614 and 911 CE, was fabricated. According to Illig and those who developed parallel theories, these centuries were not lived but inserted into the historical timeline through deliberate manipulation of documents, calendars, and chronologies. Though widely dismissed by mainstream scholars, the hypothesis raises foundational questions. What if portions of accepted history were constructed retroactively? How can we verify that a given century actually occurred? What systems ensure our confidence in chronology, and are they as unassailable as they seem? The hypothesis posits three principal claims. First, that the early Middle Ages, as we understand them, are not grounded in sufficient documentary or archaeological evidence. Second, that certain key figures, most notably Charlemagne, are either fictitious or heavily mythologized composites. And third, that the Gregorian calendar reform played a role in solidifying this fictitious chronology into official timekeeping. The implications of these claims are profound. If a fabricated historical period was successfully inserted and institutionalized, then history is not merely subject to misinterpretation, it is vulnerable to systemic invention. Illig starting point is the apparent scarcity and inconsistency of records from the 7th to 9th centuries. He identifies a conspicuous documentary gap, particularly in Western Europe, during a period that supposedly included significant historical developments, such as the Carolingian Renaissance, the reign of Charlemagne, and the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. These events, while critical to the narrative of European state formation, rest on surprisingly thin evidence when scrutinized. Surviving texts are few, often copied centuries later, and exhibit suspiciously uniform styles. Artifacts, architecture, and inscriptions from the period are either lacking or, in Illig's view, misdated to fit within an imposed chronology. One of the central pillars of the hypothesis is the assertion that Charlemagne crowned emperor in 800. Sicu's a fictional, or at least significantly embellished figure. The narrative of Charlemagne's reign comes predominantly from a small set of ecclesiastical sources, most notably the Royal Frankish Annals and Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni. These texts were written or edited under direct church supervision, long after the events they describe. According to Illig, the specificity of detail and the heroic portrayal of Charlemagne suggest a synthetic construction rather than a contemporaneous record. Additionally, the sudden appearance of Latin literacy, uniform coinage, and centralized authority in the Carolingian era stands in stark contrast to the preceding chaos of the so-called migration period, implying an abrupt historical recalibration. Further skepticism is directed toward the architectural remains from the disputed period. Structures attributed to the early medieval centuries, particularly in Central Europe, are notably few. Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals, which dominate the architectural record, begin to appear only from the 10th century onward. The gap in monumental construction raises the question: if these centuries occurred as described, where are the corresponding physical traces? To address this, mainstream historians often appeal to the loss of materials due to war, decay, or reconstruction. Yet Illig and others counter that such explanations are circular absences presumed to confirm instability, which then justifies absence. The Gregorian calendar reform is central to the theory. According to Illig, Pope Gregory XIII's 1582 adjustment to the calendar mistakenly or deliberately overestimated the time elapsed since the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. The reform was designed to correct a 10-day drift caused by the Julian calendar's slight inaccuracy. However, Illig contends that the observed astronomical discrepancy did not match what would be expected if over 1,250 years had truly passed since Nicaea. The implication is that the historical record contained approximately 3 centuries more than celestial mechanics allowed for. Rather than conclude that the Church erred in its calculation, The hypothesis suggests that the intervening time was artificially inserted. Critics of the phantom time hypothesis point to sources outside Europe, especially in the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, that appear to contain uninterrupted historical records for the disputed period. They argue that synchronisms across civilizations make large-scale fabrication implausible. Yet this defense presumes the independence of these chronologies, when in fact much of the dating in Eastern records was recalibrated by later Western historians, working from the same foundational assumptions. Furthermore, many Eastern texts were themselves recopied, translated, or harmonized by Christian and Islamic scholars with their own theological agendas, raising the possibility of circular verification. The most forceful counterarguments against Illig appeal to dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, and astronomical observations such as eclipses recorded in ancient texts. These scientific techniques are thought to anchor historical chronology independently of written records. However, the calibration curves for radiocarbon dating rely on existing chronologies to a significant degree. Dendrochronological sequences must be cross-matched with historically dated samples, and eclipse calculations depend on associating recorded events with precise years, an association made using the very historical timelines under scrutiny. This raises a troubling methodological loop. Scientific dating is often validated by historical data, which is in turn supported by scientific dating. The phantom time hypothesis, even if ultimately incorrect in its specific claims, serves a valuable function in destabilizing the perceived infallibility of historical time. It exposes the reliance on institutional continuity, manuscript authenticity, and interpretive consensus as foundational to the historical record. If these pillars are compromised by loss, forgery, or reinterpretation, then the resulting chronology becomes suspect. Whether or not centuries were fabricated, the fact that such a possibility can be entertained seriously underscores the fragility of the chronological edifice. Moreover, the hypothesis brings attention to the power of chronological construction in shaping identity. The insertion of a lineage, a ruler, or an era into the official timeline reshapes national myths, religious legitimacy, and geopolitical narratives. The Carolingian dynasty, for instance, provides a crucial link between the Roman legacy and modern Europe. If that link is spurious, then the historical continuity of the West is disrupted. In that light, the resistance to the phantom time hypothesis becomes less about defending empirical truth and more about preserving civilizational coherence. What the hypothesis ultimately invites is a re-examination of who holds the authority to define the past. If centuries can be edited, either intentionally or through accumulation of error, then time is not simply inherited, but curated. And if the curators are not neutral observers, but institutional actors with political and theological stakes, then chronology becomes a site of contestation, not consensus. This opens the investigation to the next critical inquiry: whether key figures like Charlemagne were constructed to anchor this curated time. Is the Emperor of Europe's rebirth a historical reality or a narrative placeholder in an engineered chronology? The figure of Charlemagne occupies a pivotal role in the narrative of European history. Known as the Father of Europe, his reign is credited with the revival of classical learning, the consolidation of Christian authority, and the foundation of what would become the Holy Roman Empire. His coronation in 800 CE by Pope Leo III is traditionally viewed as a turning point, a symbolic reunion of imperial Rome and Latin Christendom. Yet, when scrutinized critically, the foundations of Charlemagne's historicity exhibit significant vulnerabilities. Sparse contemporary documentation, overlapping source materials, architectural anomalies, and retrospective glorification raise the question: was Charlemagne a singular historical ruler, or a composite invention designed to anchor and legitimize a manufactured period of time? The historical sources supporting Charlemagne's existence are remarkably narrow. The most cited documents: Annal Regni Francorum, Royal Frankish Annals, Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, and a series of Carolingian capitularies, stem from a small set of ecclesiastical circles and were preserved under church custody. These texts show signs of retrospective editing and harmonization. The language in Einhard's biography, written decades after Charlemagne's death, is heavily modeled on Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars, suggesting not only literary borrowing but an ideological intent to elevate Charlemagne into a Roman imperial archetype. The problem lies not only in the lack of contemporaneity but in the homogeneity of the sources. When the primary narratives of a historical figure originate from a tightly controlled institutional environment and follow literary templates, the distinction between record and propaganda blurs. Moreover, the scarcity of material evidence from Charlemagne's reign presents another anomaly. Given his supposed role in revitalizing education, church building, and imperial administration, one would expect a proliferation of inscriptions, monuments, coins, or civic structures directly attributable to his era. Yet the architectural remnants credited to the Carolingian period, such as the Palatine Chapel in Aachen, exhibit styles that are curiously anachronistic, bearing strong resemblance to much later Romanesque forms. Some scholars argue that these structures were misdated or reattributed centuries after their construction to support the legitimacy of a Carolingian legacy. Coins from the period are likewise few and often generic, lacking consistent inscriptions or images linking them definitively to Charlemagne. The coronation in 800 CE, described in dramatic terms by later chroniclers, is itself enveloped in ambiguity. The surviving accounts differ on key details, including whether Charlemagne anticipated the coronation or was taken by surprise. The political context raises further questions. Why would the Pope crown a Frankish king as Emperor of the Romans when the Byzantine Empire, with its own emperor, remained active? Traditional explanations invoke geopolitical maneuvering or the waning influence of Byzantium in the West. Yet an alternative interpretation posits that the coronation event may have been retroactively constructed to justify the emergence of a new imperial order, one that lacked a real foundation in contemporary authority and needed historical precedent to function. The genealogical record of Charlemagne also raises suspicion. His supposed ancestry, linking him to the Merovingians and earlier Frankish rulers, depends heavily on later medieval documents, many of which have been shown to contain fabrications or interpolations. The sudden rise of the Carolingians, with Pepin the Short and then Charlemagne assuming central roles in Frankish history, is unusually smooth and unchallenged for a period otherwise characterized by dynastic conflict and regional fragmentation. The absence of competing narratives suggests either a highly successful erasure campaign or a constructed continuity, inserted to fill a historical vacuum. This becomes even more apparent when examining the transition between the late Merovingian and early Carolingian periods. The abrupt disappearance of the former dynasty and the seamless ascendancy of the latter are accompanied by a suspicious uniformity in annals and hagiographies. Some scholars have suggested that Carolingian legitimacy was retroactively written into the past to strengthen claims of divine favor and continuity. If true, then Charlemagne may not be a historical figure in the strict sense, but a narrative anchor, a carefully assembled persona, created to provide ideological coherence to a restructured chronology, the intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance is often cited as evidence of Charlemagne's historical presence. Yet this revival is documented primarily through monastic scriptoria and theological treatises, rather than civic or scientific achievements. The so-called Renaissance focused on copying existing manuscripts, establishing uniform Latin script, and enforcing doctrinal orthodoxy activities that could just as easily be attributed to monastic reformers operating under centralized ecclesiastical policies, rather than a singular imperial patron. The idea of Charlemagne as a patron of learning while deeply embedded in the modern educational mythos, may be a projection of Enlightenment values onto a constructed figure. The political utility of Charlemagne as a fabricated or embellished figure is considerable. By inserting an emperor who united Western Europe, upheld Christianity, and revived Roman prestige, the Church and emerging nation-states could claim a lineage of legitimate authority. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in the 10th century under Otto I, explicitly invoked the legacy of Charlemagne to justify its existence. Subsequent monarchs, popes, and historians continued to cite his reign as a golden age, thereby reinforcing the constructed edifice. Once the myth was embedded into the educational and religious infrastructure of Europe, questioning it became tantamount to challenging the foundations of Western civilization. If Charlemagne's reign was exaggerated, distorted, or even invented, the implications extend beyond biographical revisionism. It would suggest that a vast segment of early medieval history was scaffolded around a fictitious center. This would support the broader argument advanced by the phantom time hypothesis, that history itself can be engineered through the insertion of plausible but unverified figures into the timeline. The credibility of the surrounding centuries, documents, reforms, battles, and institutions would become suspect, dependent on the authenticity of the central anchor. In this context, it becomes important to consider how Charlemagne is represented across non-Frankish sources. Byzantine records mention Frankish rulers but do not emphasize Charlemagne's imperial claims. Islamic historians make minimal reference to a Western emperor of his stature, despite extensive interactions with the Mediterranean world. This silence may indicate regional disinterest, or it may reveal that the grandeur attributed to Charlemagne was not recognized outside the narrative zones constructed by later Western chroniclers. The selective visibility of Charlemagne in global historiography suggests that his prominence may be the result of historiographical amplification rather than empirical centrality. The possibility that Charlemagne was a post facto creation or composite figure does not rest solely on the absence of evidence. It derives from the systemic mechanisms by which institutions construct coherence out of discontinuity. The Church, the Carolingian court, and later medieval authorities had every incentive to forge a continuous past that bridged the decline of Rome and the rise of Christendom. Charlemagne offered a solution, a unifying persona who embodied both military conquest and spiritual renewal, all while legitimizing the authority of Rome's ecclesiastical hierarchy. If such a figure could be constructed and inserted into the historical record with lasting effect, then the integrity of historical time becomes an open question. It reinforces the broader thesis of this investigation, that chronology is not an empirical given, but a curated product. The past is shaped not just by what happened, but by what was preserved, promoted, and enforced. The next stage of inquiry will turn to the custodians of that preservation, the Vatican archives, and their role in sustaining or suppressing alternate timelines. How much of what we know is preserved truth, and how much is silence codified by institutional authority? The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, is one of the most expansive and impenetrable historical repositories in existence. Spanning more than 85 kilometers of shelving and containing documents from the 8th century onward, it is often portrayed as a sanctum of ecclesiastical memory, safeguarding the continuity of Western civilization. Yet for all its reputed transparency, in recent decades, the archive remains highly selective in what it allows the public or scholarly community to access. This selectivity raises critical concerns about the role of institutional custodianship in shaping history. If history depends on documentation, and the most influential documentation remains sequestered or inaccessible, then silence itself becomes a powerful form of narrative control. The Vatican's role in historical chronology is not limited to theology or liturgy. Over centuries, it functioned as one of the few institutions capable of preserving manuscripts, copying texts, and enforcing calendrical and historical norms across Christendom. Through papal bulls, ecclesiastical councils, and theological commentary, the Church curated not only the content of history, but its structure. As the sole authority with both the means and motivation to filter historical data, it exerted unique influence over what would be remembered, what would be discarded, and what would be repurposed to fit evolving doctrine. The silence of the archive is not passive. It is curated through policies that classify vast swaths of documents for indefinite periods. While parts of the archive have been gradually opened, most notably those concerning the World Wars and the papacies of the 20th century, significant eras remain shrouded in bureaucratic opacity. Scholars must apply for access, undergo vetting, and are restricted in the quantity and nature of materials they can view. Not all requests are granted, and even approved scholars encounter limited viewing time, strict reproduction rules, and a dependency on Vatican-controlled inventories. The result is not openness, but a tightly regulated system of historical visibility. This control becomes particularly suspect when examined in light of historical periods already marked by ambiguity or chronological instability. The centuries implicated in the phantom time hypothesis, particularly the 7th through 9th, fall precisely within a zone of limited documentation. While church histories insist on the uninterrupted continuation of institutional memory through these centuries, the absence of independent corroboration and the scarcity of material culture from the period undermine such claims. The question arises, if crucial materials from this time exist in the archives, why are they not openly available? And if they do not exist, why does the Church maintain an aura of confidence in their historical continuity? Moreover, the institutional motivation to shape history in line with theological imperatives cannot be dismissed. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Church historians had a vested interest in demonstrating apostolic continuity, theological primacy, and political legitimacy. This narrative coherence required not only affirming certain events, but also smoothing over contradictions, anachronisms, and voids. In some cases, documents were interpolated, redated, or rewritten. Forged papal decrees such as the donation of Constantine illustrate the willingness of Church scribes to manipulate historical texts for ideological ends. While later exposed as forgeries, such documents had already shaped centuries of policy and belief. The Vatican's monopoly on manuscript duplication further entrenched its control over history. In the absence of a printing press, the scriptoriums of monastic and cathedral institutions were the only locations where texts were reproduced. Every copy made was a potential site of revision. Even well-intentioned scribes introduced errors, and less scrupulous ones had the power to reshape narratives. Subtly, over time, these revisions crystallized into canonical versions of history. Without access to original manuscripts, many of which are sequestered or lost, historians must rely on layered copies whose provenance and fidelity are often unverifiable. In the modern period, efforts to digitize the archive have been heralded as moves toward transparency. Yet digital access remains curated, with priority given to materials of diplomatic or theological interest. The vast stretches of early medieval content remain either inaccessible or unexplored. The claim that everything essential is eventually made available presumes an institutional neutrality that is contradicted by the Church's documented history of selective disclosure. The process of releasing documents often follows political, not chronological, logic. This curated silence fosters a dangerous asymmetry. Academic historians working outside the Church must construct chronologies based on published data, while the Church retains exclusive access to potentially contradictory or clarifying information. In effect, the Vatican functions as both source and censor, authorizing what becomes part of historical consciousness, while suppressing or withholding what might disrupt its narrative. Architecture. The implications extend beyond ecclesiastical history. If the Church holds chronologically sensitive material that contradicts accepted timelines and withholds it for doctrinal or political reasons, then entire periods of human history may be based on incomplete or manipulated evidence. Even the decision to omit material, to let it languish unexamined in inaccessible repositories, is an act of historical intervention. What is not seen cannot be questioned. What is not questioned cannot be revised. Furthermore, the theological framework within which the Vatican interprets time influences the structure of its archival management. Ecclesiastical time is fundamentally teleological, moving from creation to judgment, with Christ as the fulcrum of all history. Within this schema, history must conform to doctrinal sequence. Any material that disrupts or destabilizes this linearity is not merely problematic, it is heretical. This gives theological justification to the suppression or reinterpretation of historical anomalies. The absence of controversy is not evidence of stability, but of censorship successfully applied. This epistemic closure becomes particularly dangerous when church-validated chronologies are used as calibration points for secular science. Radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, for example, often require historical anchor points to translate data into calendar years. If those anchors are based on church-determined dates that are themselves artifacts of institutional construction, then the entire scientific apparatus of dating is indirectly compromised. Once chronology is circularly justified, it ceases to function as independent verification and becomes dogma. The Vatican archives are not the only institutions capable of this type of control, but they are perhaps the most enduring and globally influential. Over more than a millennium, they have shaped the historical imagination not only of Catholics, but of Western civilization at large. Their silence is not the silence of absence, it is the silence of dominance. What is preserved is not simply what was, but what must be believed to have been. If history is built upon documents, and documents are controlled, then history itself is a function of access. The Vatican's asymmetric control over archival material has created a monopoly on the past. This monopoly has enabled the construction of a coherent, but potentially fictitious historical narrative, one that resists revision not through evidence, but through inaccessibility. The next section will examine how this monopoly extended beyond documents to encompass calendar systems themselves. Through a series of papal bulls and decrees, the Church not only preserved time but recalibrated it, dictating not just how history should be read, but how time should be measured. Who controls the calendar controls the perception of all that it contains. The authority to define the calendar has historically been wielded as more than a practical or astronomical necessity. It has functioned as an assertion of spiritual jurisdiction, political power, and cultural hegemony. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, this authority was centralized most decisively in the papacy. Through the issuance of papal bulls, formal decrees of the Pope, the Roman Catholic Church imposed not only religious doctrine, but also temporal structures that regulated how time itself was measured, structured, and understood. These decrees, though often framed as administrative acts, had the effect of subordinating entire populations to a calendar. Rooted in ecclesiastical logic, a papal bull was not a mere suggestion or recommendation. It carried the full force of pontifical command, often bearing legal, theological, and social consequences. When Pope Gregory XIII issued the bull Inter Gravissimas in 1582, he was not initiating a discussion on timekeeping, but enforcing a recalibration of temporal reality. The Gregorian calendar, instituted through this decree, replaced the Julian calendar in Catholic territories with immediate effect. It was an authoritative erasure and realignment of time. 10 days were declared non-existent, and leap year rules were revised to reflect a different system of astronomical correlation. The power to make days vanish, to legislate time retroactively, speaks to the unparalleled jurisdiction The papacy claimed over temporal order. This authority had precedent. Earlier papal bulls had established feast days, coordinated fasting seasons, and dictated the annual dating of Easter, a movable feast whose calculation was notoriously complex. The computus, developed and enforced by church scholars, linked Easter's timing to both lunar cycles and the spring equinox. This entanglement of theology and astronomy positioned the Church as the indispensable interpreter of time, since no secular institution could calculate liturgical dates independently of ecclesiastical guidance. As the Church standardized these calculations, it simultaneously solidified its claim to manage the historical record. The Christian calendar, with its division into BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, was enforced through liturgical rhythm and reinforced by the labeling of all church documents. Every event, from births to deaths to land grants, was dated according to the ecclesiastical system. Over time, this framework became the default reference not only for church matters, but for state governance, legal transactions, and cultural memory. The calendar thus ceased to be a tool of measurement and became an ideological container for historical meaning. The power embedded in papal bulls was further amplified by their cumulative effects. A single decree could redefine the start of the year, reorder the saints' feast days, or prohibit the use of local calendars. Over centuries, these small adjustments accumulated into a vast transformation of temporal consciousness. Regional systems such as the Byzantine calendar, the Hebrew lunar calendar, or even the Roman consular dating system were increasingly marginalized or forced into compatibility with the dominant ecclesiastical framework. What began as religious coordination became imperial consolidation. This suppression of calendrical diversity was not accidental. It reflected a deeper theological ambition to present Christian time as universal time. In this framework, creation marked the absolute beginning, Christ's incarnation marked the fulcrum of history, and Judgment Day awaited as the end. All time was thus teleological, oriented toward divine culmination. By placing itself at the center of this timeline, the Church claimed not only authority over the present, but over all of history, past, present, and future. Papal bulls were instruments for enforcing this eschatological vision, embedding it in the practical infrastructure of everyday life. Resistance to this control was not uncommon. Various groups and regions refused to adopt papal calendar reforms, either for political, theological, or practical reasons. The Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, rejected the Gregorian calendar and continues to use the Julian system for religious observance. Protestant countries delayed adoption, suspicious of what they saw as a Catholic imposition disguised as astronomical correction. Revolutionary France attempted to abolish the Christian calendar altogether, introducing the French Republican calendar to reflect secular and rationalist values. These moments of rupture highlight the centrality of calendrical control to broader ideological conflicts. Timekeeping, far from being neutral, became a proxy war for cultural dominance. The consequences of papal control over the calendar also extended to the structuring of history itself. Church historians, using the papal calendar as their reference, recorded events according to the rhythm and framing it imposed. When modern historians refer to events as occurring in 800 AD or 1054 AD, they are not merely using a convenient dating system, they are invoking a chronology shaped and authorized by papal intervention. This dating embeds theological assumptions into historical representation, rendering secular events in a religious temporal structure. Even the widespread use of the Anno Domini dating system owes its prevalence to papal enforcement. Though introduced in the 6th century by Dionysius Exiguus, it only gained widespread traction through church adoption and propagation via official documents and councils. By the High Medieval period, it had become the dominant system across Latin Christendom. This ascendancy was not inevitable, it was the result of repeated institutional decisions, reinforced by papal decrees and ecclesiastical conformity. Another mechanism of control was the Liber Pontificalis, a chronicle of papal reigns used to structure church history. Though appearing to be a straightforward record, the Liber was continually updated and revised, with gaps filled retroactively. Its chronological claims were treated as authoritative, despite questions about the authenticity of early entries. The power to define when popes ruled, who preceded whom, and what councils occurred under which pontificate, allowed the Church to anchor its authority in a meticulously curated historical continuity. When these records became the basis for broader historical chronologies, they extended papal influence into the secular domain. The practical effects of these bulls continue into the present. The Gregorian calendar remains the international civil standard, recognized and used by nearly every nation. Global commerce, legal systems, academic research, and digital technologies all synchronize to a framework that originated in a 16th century papal decree. Even when stripped of its religious associations, the calendar's architecture reflects the ecclesiastical logic of its origins. Time itself, as structured and experienced globally, is a lingering artifact of papal authority, to frame the papal bull as a mere document is to miss its broader implications. It is a declaration of jurisdiction over the structure of reality, a fiat that alters the terms by which the past is measured and the future anticipated. The Church, in issuing such decrees, functioned not only as a spiritual guide, but as a temporal engineer, designing the scaffolding upon which memory, governance, and identity would rest. As the investigation deepens, attention must now turn to the justifications used by the Church to defend its calendrical interventions. Chief among these was the appeal to astronomy, the idea that reforms were necessary to align sacred time with the movements of the heavens. Yet a deeper analysis will reveal that the relationship between astronomical observation and ecclesiastical authority was anything but neutral. The next section will interrogate whether astronomy served the Church's reforms, or whether it was co-opted to lend those reforms the aura of objectivity, one of the primary justifications invoked by the Catholic Church during the Gregorian Reform and throughout earlier liturgical developments was the claim of astronomical necessity. The assertion was that timekeeping must conform to celestial mechanics, especially the solar year and the equinoxes, in order to preserve the integrity of sacred festivals. The reform of the calendar in 1582 was framed as an effort to restore Easter to its correct place relative to the vernal equinox. Yet when examined critically, this appeal to astronomy appears less as a neutral alignment with natural law and more as a strategic invocation of scientific legitimacy to enforce ecclesiastical control. The Church did not submit to astronomy, it enlisted astronomy as an instrument of theological and political consolidation. Astronomical observation has always had a dual character. On the one hand, it offers empirical data derived from measurable phenomena, solstices, equinoxes, lunar phases, eclipses. On the other hand, it functions symbolically within theological systems that interpret celestial events as divine signs. In medieval Christendom, the boundary between astronomy and astrology was porous, and the heavens were as much a source of revelation as calculation. The Church, while suspicious of certain astrological practices, recognized the utility of celestial phenomena in affirming liturgical order. Astronomy thus became a site of appropriation, where empirical findings were filtered through doctrinal imperatives. The calculation of Easter is a revealing example. The compute is the complex formula for determining the date of Easter relies on both solar and lunar cycles. Its mathematical intricacy has often been mistaken for precision, but its true function is theological. Easter must fall on the Sunday following the first full moon after the vernal equinox, in order to maintain its symbolic relationship to Passover and the resurrection narrative. The problem arises when the equinox shifts due to calendar drift. Rather than adjust the theology to accommodate observational variance, the Church historically adjusted the calendar to preserve theological sequence. Thus, the astronomical justification was reactive, not foundational. The Gregorian reform's alignment with the vernal equinox of March 21, a date fixed by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, was based on restoring a symbolic continuity, not recalibrating the calendar to actual astronomical conditions of the Reform period. In 1582, the true equinox was occurring closer to March 11th. By skipping 10 days, the Church returned the calendar to its Nicene alignment, but that decision relied on a theological benchmark rather than empirical measurement. It was a return, not to natural time, but to ecclesiastical time sanctified by precedent. The role of Jesuit astronomers, particularly Christopher Clavius, further complicates the narrative. Clavius, the chief architect of the Gregorian reform, was a brilliant mathematician who framed the reform in scientific terms. Yet he remained a loyal servant of papal authority and worked within a framework where empirical data had to serve doctrinal needs. His calculations, though precise, were not subject to open peer review or independent replication. The process of reform remained cloaked in institutional secrecy. Critics of the reform pointed out that the Church was asking the world to accept a revision of time based on inaccessible data and unverifiable logic. The selective use of astronomy also reveals inconsistencies. While the Church embraced solar and lunar calculations to correct Easter, it continued to resist other astronomical findings that threatened its cosmological hierarchy. The persecution of Galileo Galilei in the early 17th century, following his defense of heliocentrism, demonstrates the limits of the Church's engagement with astronomy. The same institution that claimed to correct the calendar in the name of celestial accuracy suppressed observations that contradicted its scriptural interpretations. This contradiction exposes the instrumental nature of ecclesiastical astronomy. It was embraced when it reinforced theological orthodoxy, and rejected when it undermined institutional authority. Furthermore, astronomical records from other civilizations were excluded or disregarded in shaping the Christian calendar. Chinese, Islamic, Indian, and Mayan astronomers had developed highly accurate observational systems, many of which revealed discrepancies with Western chronologies. Yet these were not incorporated into the Gregorian reform. Instead, the Church positioned its own system as universal, despite its limited empirical base and theological dependence. This selective universality highlights the reform's ideological dimension. The aim was not to reflect the cosmos, but to impose a temporal regime that could be universally obeyed. The Church's approach to astronomical synchronization thus reveals a deeper logic of legitimation. Astronomy, when cited, served as a rhetorical device to mask the imposition of a dogmatic structure. By invoking the heavens, the Church cloaked human decisions in divine necessity. The shift in the calendar was framed as an act of fidelity to creation, when in fact it was an assertion of control over the interpretation of creation. In this model, observation was not an end, but a means, a way to lend authority to decisions already made on theological grounds. This co-opting of astronomy also shaped historical chronology. Celestial events such as eclipses were used as chronological anchors in historical texts. A battle was said to have occurred during a solar eclipse. A king's death coincided with a lunar event. These correlations were often retroactively applied, aligning historical narratives with astronomical records to create the illusion of precision. But the accuracy of these associations depends entirely on the reliability of both the historical and the astronomical data. In many cases, the identification of an eclipse or planetary conjunction is speculative, based on backward calculations that presume the correctness of the very chronology they are supposed to verify. This circularity undermines the claim that Astronomical synchronization provides independent confirmation of historical timelines. Modern defenders of traditional chronology often point to astronomy as its empirical foundation. They cite eclipse records, planetary motions, and celestial mechanics as evidence that the calendar must be correct. Yet this defense overlooks the degree to which historical astronomy has been retrofitted to match established timelines. The raw data, when it exists, is interpreted through the lens of a chronology already presumed accurate. Discrepant events are either ignored or manipulated to fit the schema. Thus, far from validating history, astronomical synchronization often functions as its rationalization. The institutional control of astronomical knowledge also played a role in this process. Observatories were typically church-affiliated or state-controlled. Access to instruments, records, and calculations was limited to authorized personnel. Competing interpretations were rarely permitted open expression. When dissent did arise, as in the case of calendrical reform resistors or alternative cosmologies, it was marginalized or suppressed. The resulting hegemony in astronomical discourse mirrored the hegemony in historical narrative. This selective embrace of astronomy allowed the Church to maintain its authority while appearing to modernize. It could present itself as scientifically progressive without relinquishing doctrinal control. The Gregorian reform, therefore, was not the triumph of science over faith. It was the strategic deployment of selective science in the service of institutional continuity. The deeper implication is that chronology, even when dressed in the garb of empirical observation, remains subject to ideological construction. Astronomy, far from offering a neutral standard, becomes a tool manipulated to reinforce existing narratives. The invocation of the heavens does not guarantee truth. It signals a strategy of legitimacy. The next step in this investigation is to examine the chronological frameworks that preceded and competed with the ecclesiastical system. Of particular interest are the biblical genealogies used to construct sacred history. These lineages, presented as literal timelines, were instrumental in fusing theology with chronology. But were they reliable historical anchors or interpretive instruments designed to force history into a predetermined structure? Biblical chronology has long served as one of the foundational structures upon which Western conceptions of historical time have been constructed. From the early centuries of Christianity to the Enlightenment, scholars, theologians, and chroniclers relied heavily on genealogical records embedded in sacred texts to chart the timeline of human history. These genealogies, particularly those found in the books of Genesis, Numbers, and the Gospels, were not treated as symbolic or theological narratives, but as literal frameworks for measuring elapsed time since creation. The result was the creation of a historical continuum in which biblical events were anchored to specific years, and secular history was often made to conform to these scripturally derived reference points. Yet a close examination of these genealogies raises significant questions about their reliability, interpretive flexibility, and ultimate function within a constructed chronology. The practice of using biblical genealogies to build chronological systems can be traced most clearly to early Christian exegetes, particularly Eusebius of Caesarea, whose Chronicon attempted to synchronize biblical and classical history. Eusebius relied on the genealogical ages listed in Genesis. Adam begat Seth at 130, Seth begat Enosh at 105, and so on, accumulating these lifespans into a linear progression that purported to provide the number of years from creation to the birth of Christ. His methodology was later refined by figures like the Venerable Bede and, most influentially, James Ussher, the 17th century Anglican Archbishop of Armagh, who famously dated the creation to 4004 BC. Ussher's chronology was widely accepted in the English-speaking world and printed in the margins of many Bibles for generations. At the heart of these calculations lies the assumption that the genealogies are complete, continuous, and free from symbolic or literary compression. However, this Assumption is not supported by textual evidence. Biblical genealogies frequently contain gaps, redundancies, and inconsistencies. The genealogies in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 differ across manuscript traditions. The Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch each preserve different figures for the ages of patriarchs, sometimes differing by more than a century. These discrepancies result in vastly different chronologies depending on which textual tradition is privileged. For example, the Septuagint version adds over a millennium to the timeline compared to the Masoretic text. Furthermore, the literary function of genealogies in the ancient Near Eastern context was not strictly chronological. They often served to establish legitimacy, tribal affiliation, or divine favor rather than to convey precise temporal data. The number of generations, symbolic patterns, and numerological motifs suggest that these lists were crafted with theological or narrative intent. In Matthew's Gospel, for instance, the genealogy of Jesus is divided into 3 sets of 14 generations, a numerological structure that prioritizes symmetry over completeness. Such stylization casts doubt on the use of these texts as historical scaffolding. Despite these issues, ecclesiastical and secular scholars persisted in treating these genealogies as chronometric instruments. This persistence reflects not a commitment to empirical rigor, but a theological imperative to anchor human history in divine origin and providential design. A chronology that begins with Adam and culminates in Christ provides a closed, meaningful structure in which all of history is subsumed within the salvific narrative. The construction of this chronology enabled the Church to assert not only theological authority but also historical authority. It made ecclesiastical institutions the guardians of both spiritual and temporal truth. The fusion of biblical time with historical time also allowed the Church to integrate secular events into its sacred calendar. Empires, plagues, astronomical events, and invasions were interpreted as consequences within a divine plan. When eclipses occurred or comets appeared, they were dated and contextualized within the biblical timeline. History became a kind of exegesis, a reading of God's unfolding intentions across time. This theological interpretation rendered alternate timelines or non-Christian chronologies suspect, even heretical. Competing historical systems, such as those from Babylonian king lists, Egyptian dynastic records, or Chinese court annals, were forced into alignment with the biblical model or dismissed as aberrant. This imposition of coherence often involved arbitrary correlations and selective interpretation. Ancient kings were assigned to biblical epochs despite a lack of direct evidence. Chronologies were flattened to preserve the primacy of biblical events. For example, the destruction of Troy or the reign of Hammurabi might be dated in relation to the Exodus or the Flood. Despite profound differences in cultural frameworks and evidentiary bases, the methodological consequences of this approach were far-reaching. By treating theological texts as historical records, early chronologists locked history into a rigid sequence that could not accommodate contradictory evidence. Archaeological finds, astronomical retrocalculations, and cultural histories that failed to align with the biblical timeline were either adjusted or ignored. The entire framework of ancient history, particularly in Western academia, was calibrated to match an inherited chronology whose foundations were theological, not empirical, even as Enlightenment-era historians began to question the literalism of biblical accounts. They retained many of the structural assumptions derived from scriptural chronology. Figures like Scaliger and Ussher laid down the timelines that later scholars used to anchor their dating of classical antiquity and early medieval Europe. The Gregorian calendar, with its Christian roots, provided the overarching structure within which these dates were embedded. Thus, even secular history bears the imprint of biblical time. The problem becomes particularly acute when modern scientific dating methods rely on historical chronologies for calibration. Radiocarbon dating, for example, requires calibration. Curves based on dendrochronology and historically dated samples. If those samples were originally dated using the timeline derived from theological sources, then the objectivity of the science is compromised. It creates a loop. Biblical time influences historical dates, which are used to calibrate scientific methods, which are then used to confirm the biblical time. This circularity is rarely acknowledged but critically undermines claims of independence. In chronological verification, the reliance on biblical genealogies also influences the perceived length of human civilization. If humanity is believed to be only 6,000 years old, as per Ussher's chronology, then ancient sites, traditions, and technologies must be compressed into a narrow window. This has led to the marginalization or recontextualization of anomalies. Megalithic architecture, pre-dynastic cultures, and pre-agricultural technologies that challenge the assumed timeline. The need to fit all human history into a sacred framework discourages exploration of dissonant evidence. In more recent centuries, as archaeological and genetic research has extended the known human timeline, biblical chronology has receded from academic dominance. Yet its influence lingers in subtle ways. Standard timelines of civilization continue to reflect epochs defined by scriptural categories: the flood, the Exodus, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Babylonian captivity. These epochs serve as organizational anchors, even when the narratives themselves are treated as allegorical. The structural legacy of biblical time remains embedded in the architecture of historical thought. Ultimately, biblical genealogies did not merely offer a timeline, they imposed a logic. That logic shaped what counted as history, whose records were prioritized, and how temporal continuity was constructed. It fused theology with chronology, belief with measurement, narrative with sequence. To question it is not simply to engage in historical revision, but to unravel a theological worldview that has organized Western conceptions of time for millennia. In the next phase of this investigation, attention will shift beyond the Christian world to examine whether similar chronological anomalies or voids exist in other civilizations. Are the missing years of the so-called Dark Ages mirrored elsewhere? Or do non-Western timelines expose the artificiality of the Western chronological consensus? If the timeline of Western history, particularly the early medieval centuries, is potentially subject to manipulation or fabrication, the question arises whether similar chronological anomalies exist in the records of non-Western civilizations. Do other historical traditions independently corroborate the missing years attributed to Europe's Dark Ages, or do they reveal parallel gaps, distortions, or compressions? To answer this, it is necessary to examine the chronological structures and historical documentation of other major civilizational centers: China, the Islamic world, India, and Mesoamerica. The objective is not to suggest that these civilizations conspired in a common fabrication, but rather to assess whether their timelines independently validate, conflict with, or remain indifferent to the Western chronological consensus. China presents the most continuous and comprehensive historiographical tradition outside the Western world. Dynastic chronicles such as the Shiji, Records of the Grand Historian, the Book of Han, and the Zizi Tongjian offer long sequences of dated events, often anchored by celestial phenomena such as eclipses and comets. At first glance, these records appear to offer robust chronological stability. However, several problems emerge upon closer scrutiny. First, Chinese historical dating was often tied to regnal years and lacked a consistent, absolute chronology until modern synchronization efforts were applied. Second, the dating of earlier dynasties, particularly those before the Qin, was reconstructed much later, often based on moralistic or didactic agendas. Gaps, mythical reigns, and anachronistic interpolations are acknowledged by sinologists, especially in the Xia and Shang periods. Third, when attempting to align Chinese records with European events from 614 to 911 CE. The correspondence is not as straightforward as often assumed. There is no direct Chinese record of European events from that period, and mutual awareness was minimal. What does exist are records of diplomatic missions and rare contact points, such as Nestorian Christian arrivals in China during the Tang Dynasty, but these are episodic and do not confirm specific chronological anchors. Importantly, the Tang Dynasty's internal timeline, while relatively rich in documentation, suffers from periods of turmoil and fragmentation that complicate precise synchronization with Western history. The Inlushan Rebellion, 755 to 763, and the subsequent decline of central authority led to gaps in imperial control and potential distortions in record keeping. Though China did not experience a phantom time per se, its timeline does not offer independent confirmation of contested Western centuries. In the Islamic world, the historiographical tradition gained traction following the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in the mid-8th century. Islamic historiography, especially under scholars such as al-Tabari and al-Masudi, recorded events in the Islamic calendar, Hijri, beginning in 622 CE with the Prophet Muhammad's migration to Medina. These histories were compiled with impressive detail, but they too suffer from internal inconsistencies and theological filtering. Like their Christian counterparts, Islamic historians wrote with doctrinal agendas, seeking to align history with divine providence and religious legitimacy. Chronologies were frequently reconstructed retroactively based on oral tradition, with limited contemporary documentation. When aligning Islamic history with European events, the difficulties multiply. The Hijri calendar is lunar, creating discrepancies when synchronizing with the solar Gregorian or Julian calendars. Moreover, while there are records of the Byzantine Empire and occasional references to European polities, these are sparse and often ambiguous. Crucially, Islamic sources provide scant independent attestation of Carolingian Europe, Charlemagne, or the events of the so-called Dark Ages. The absence of engagement or reference to central Western figures from 614 to 911 CE undermines the claim that the period is universally corroborated. While the Islamic world itself experienced considerable development, especially in science, philosophy, and architecture, its records function in a largely separate chronological ecosystem. In the Indian subcontinent, historical records from the early medieval period are characterized by fragmentary inscriptions, dynastic lists, and religious texts. Chronology in Indian historiography has traditionally been non-linear, with mythological time coexisting alongside historical time. The concept of cyclical epochs, yugas, shaped the temporal imagination. Attempts to construct linear histories often came much later and were influenced by colonial or modern academic efforts. Dynastic chronologies, such as those of the Gupta or Chalukya empires, were often assembled retrospectively based on inscriptions or coinage, not continuous annals, from approximately 500 to 900 CE. Indian history exhibits significant lacunae, particularly in the Deccan and southern regions. Scholars have described this interval as the early medieval period, marked by decentralization, localized polities, and a decline in grand imperial narratives. Though religious and philosophical activity persisted, large-scale documentation and coherent political chronology are limited. As in Europe, this has led to theories of missing centuries, compressed timelines, and reconstructed dynastic sequences. The absence of a sustained literary historiographical tradition during this time limits the capacity of Indian records to either confirm or contradict the Western chronology. Again, the data is insufficiently independent. In the Americas, the Mesoamerican calendar systems, particularly those of the Maya, offer perhaps the most mathematically sophisticated pre-modern timekeeping. The Maya long count calendar tracked time in intervals far exceeding any other pre-Columbian system. and stele inscriptions provide specific dates that have been correlated with the Gregorian system using astronomical events such as solar eclipses and Venus cycles. However, the correlation itself, the so-called GMT correlation, is based on assumptions derived from Western chronology. The anchoring of long count dates to the Gregorian calendar presupposes the accuracy of the latter. If Gregorian chronology were flawed, the correlation would likewise be destabilized. Additionally, Mesoamerican history during the proposed Phantom period, 614 to 911 CE, shows regional fragmentation and political decline, particularly in the classic Maya collapse circa 800 to 900 CE, but does not produce records that intersect with Eurasian chronology. No cross-verification is possible. The comparative analysis of non-Western chronologies reveals a paradox. On the one hand, these civilizations maintained independent temporal frameworks that were not directly derived from Western ecclesiastical timekeeping. On the other hand, none offer concrete evidence that either supports or contradicts the existence of the three contested centuries in European history. Their isolation, internal inconsistencies, and limited contact with Europe during this period mean that their timelines cannot function as definitive controls. Where overlaps do exist, they are either vague or filtered through much later synchronization efforts by modern historians. This situation presents a problem of epistemological insulation. Each civilizational chronology operates within its own narrative and structural logics. Attempts to harmonize them require translation, approximation, and the application of Western chronological assumptions. When Egyptian dynasties are aligned with biblical kings, or when Chinese eclipses are used to date Babylonian reigns, the alignment is not neutral, it is interpretive. These connections are imposed, not intrinsic. If multiple civilizations experience chronological gaps, inconsistencies, or reconstructions in the same broad time frame, the conclusion need not be that they colluded in a deception. Rather, it may indicate that the very tools of chronology, record keeping, calendar systems, institutional continuity, are fragile and vulnerable to failure or manipulation. The absence of definitive cross-verification suggests that no single civilization holds a completely independent and unbroken record of historical time. The implications are sobering. Without external confirmation, the Western historical timeline from 614 to 911 CE remains dependent on its own sources, many of which are ecclesiastical, edited, or reconstructed centuries after the fact. Non-Western timelines offer little in the way of rescue. Their silence is not agreement, it is absence. The next step in this investigation is to examine the ways in which historians have attempted to bridge this absence. Specifically, how have historical events been synchronized across civilizations to create the illusion of coherence? Are these synchronisms based on empirical connections, or are they artificially manufactured to uphold a timeline too fragile to stand on its own? One of the central mechanisms by which modern chronology is reinforced is the use of historical synchronisms, the intentional alignment of events, reigns, or developments across different civilizations to construct a unified, coherent global timeline. These synchronisms are widely used in historiography, appearing in comparative timelines, textbooks, and academic reference works to show, for instance, that Charlemagne ruled in Europe while Harun al-Rashid presided over the Abbasid Caliphate, or that the Tang dynasty flourished in China during the height of the Umayyad expansion. At face value, these cross-cultural connections suggest a reliable, well-verified historical consensus. But when examined critically, synchronisms reveal themselves to be one of the most vulnerable and problematic components in the construction of global chronology. They are not always the result of direct contact, parallel development, or independently recorded events. They are often artifacts of retroactive harmonization, inference, or even strategic fabrication, Synchronisms, by design, require more than mere contemporaneity. For a synchronism to have historiographical value, it must be based on credible, datable, and verifiable records from both sides of the proposed connection. However, the historical record often fails to provide this symmetrical evidence. Many synchronisms are created by correlating richly documented events in one civilization with poorly attested events in another. This imbalance gives undue weight to dominant sources, typically Western or ecclesiastical, and forces less documented timelines to conform. The synchronism then becomes circular. The dominant timeline confirms the event, and the confirmation strengthens the dominant timeline. For example, one widely cited synchronism places the embassy from Charlemagne to Harun al-Rashid in the early 800s as a marker of intercultural diplomacy. This is taken as an independent corroboration of Charlemagne's reign. But the actual documentation of this event comes almost exclusively from Latin sources, with vague or absent references in Islamic historiography. The presence of artifacts or gifts allegedly exchanged during these embassies is often based on interpretive extrapolation rather than archaeological confirmation. Without reciprocal documentation or physical evidence, the synchronism stands on uncertain ground. Another form of synchronization involves astronomical events. Scholars retrocalculate solar eclipses or comets recorded in Chinese, Babylonian, or Islamic sources and then match these to events in the Western timeline. While astronomical phenomena are objectively calculable, the dating of the associated historical events is not. Ancient texts often refer to eclipses or celestial signs in vague terms, lacking precise geographical or calendrical information. Moreover, the choice of which eclipse corresponds to which historical moment is made based on the assumption that the underlying chronology is correct. This methodological loop weakens the synchronism's credibility. Chronological alignment of dynasties across civilizations also suffers from forced correlations. For example, historians have attempted to line up Egyptian dynasties with Mesopotamian kings, or Chinese dynasties with Greco-Roman events by matching reign lengths or overlapping cultural phases. But these correlations are often speculative and based on relative chronology sequences of rulers without fixed absolute dates. The effort to attach these sequences to a global calendar requires selecting anchor points from one civilization, usually Greco-Roman, and imposing those on others. The result is a form of chronological colonization, where independent historical traditions are reshaped to fit a master timeline. The problem becomes especially acute when dealing with civilizations that lack continuous written records. In such cases, synchronisms are constructed not from texts but from typological comparison similarities in pottery, architecture, burial customs, or coinage. These material indicators are then dated by association with better documented cultures. For example, artifacts found in Central Asia might be dated by their resemblance to Sassanid coins, which in turn are dated by their appearance in Roman hoards, which are themselves dated by references in Latin chronicles. Each link in the chain introduces new uncertainties, and the final synchronism is often more assumption than fact. Even when written records exist, the process of translation and interpretation adds layers of ambiguity. Ancient terms for months, years, or astronomical cycles vary significantly between cultures and are often translated with presupposition about equivalence. The result is a distortion in which dates appear to align precisely, but only because the source texts have been reinterpreted through the lens of modern chronological expectations. This retroactive alignment conceals the original context and forces events into a fabricated simultaneity. The strategic function of synchronisms also deserves attention. By aligning the histories of diverse civilizations, scholars, and institutions, create the impression of a continuous, interconnected human narrative. This supports the authority of world historical surveys, encyclopedias, and educational curricula that present history as a linear, cumulative process. Synchronisms validate this structure, allowing history to be taught, remembered, and interpreted as a coherent whole. They also serve ideological purposes, such as reinforcing the idea of a shared civilizational destiny or asserting the primacy of certain cultural centers in human progress. Synchronisms are not inherently invalid. In cases where there is clear evidence of contact, such as trade routes, shared diplomatic records, or mutual references in independent texts, they can serve as valuable tools. But these cases are relatively rare and often heavily contested. The more typical synchronism is one in which gaps in one record are papered over by assuming coherence with another. These assumptions, once repeated in textbooks or academic publications, become canonical. The synchronism is no longer treated as a hypothesis, but as a fact, embedded in historical consciousness. The danger is that these manufactured parallels reinforce a chronology that may be fundamentally flawed. If the underlying timelines of various civilizations are uncertain, then synchronisms do not confirm accuracy, they distribute error. A misdated event in one chronology becomes a fixed point in another. The result is a network of historical anchors that all rest on compromised foundations. This makes the entire structure vulnerable to collapse if even a few key synchronisms are invalidated. The issue also intersects with the phantom time hypothesis. Proponents of the hypothesis argue that the artificial insertion of centuries into European history was supported by the construction of synchronisms that lent credibility to fabricated epics. If Charlemagne's reign is aligned with Islamic or Chinese events through weak or unverifiable synchronisms, then these correlations may have served to cement a timeline that did not actually exist. The appearance of global coherence masks the underlying absence of direct evidence. Critically, the academic community has been reluctant to reevaluate these synchronisms. Doing so would not only challenge specific historical claims, but would also undermine the authority of a deeply entrenched chronological system. Research funding, educational standards, and cultural memory are all bound to this structure. As a result, synchronisms remain largely unquestioned, functioning more as stabilizing myths than as empirically confirmed data points. In moving forward, this investigation must now ask, who engineered these synchronisms? What institutional mechanisms supported their propagation, and to what ends? A closer look at the role of Jesuit scholars, key agents in the diffusion of European historiography, astronomical knowledge, and educational systems may reveal how synchronisms were constructed and imposed, both in Europe and in the colonial periphery. Were the Jesuits defenders of historical truth, or architects of temporal coherence serving larger strategic goals? Among the most influential agents in the construction and dissemination of historical chronology during the early modern period were members of the Society of Jesus, known commonly as the Jesuits. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit order quickly became one of the most powerful arms of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Tasked with confronting Protestant influence, defending Catholic orthodoxy, and advancing education and missionary work globally, the Jesuits embedded themselves in nearly every domain of intellectual and institutional power. Nowhere was their impact more significant than in the field of time, calendar reform, historiography, astronomical observation, and the coordination of global chronology all passed through the hands of Jesuit scholars. Their role in shaping temporal structures, both in Europe and in colonized territories, reveals a coordinated effort to construct not merely a narrative of history, but the very scaffold of time upon which that narrative could be suspended. Jesuits were deeply embedded in the scientific and theological apparatus of the Gregorian calendar reform. Christopher Clavius, the chief mathematician responsible for implementing the reform, was a Jesuit. His influence extended beyond calendar mechanics to the interpretation of astronomical events, the revision of Easter tables, and the theological justification for the papal intervention in timekeeping. Clavius's writings formed the core of Jesuit education in the sciences and were disseminated widely through Jesuit colleges, which by the 17th century formed the largest educational network in Europe. This meant that the post-reform calendar was not only enacted, but systematically taught to future generations of clerics, scholars, and administrators. Through this institutional framework, the Jesuits exercised control over both the content and structure of historical time. Their schools trained the elite in nations from Spain to Poland, from Italy to the Philippines, inculcating a unified view of history and chronology that aligned with Roman Catholic orthodoxy. Divergent or localized temporalities, whether religious, astronomical, or historical, were overwritten by a single model grounded in the Gregorian system. This was not limited to Europe. As Jesuits expanded their missions into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they brought with them the apparatus of temporal alignment. Local calendars were studied, not to preserve them, but to convert them, to make them legible within the dominant Western structure. In China, for instance, Jesuit missionaries such as Matteo Ricci, Johann Adam Schall von Bell, and Ferdinand Verbiest played a key role in reforming the Chinese imperial calendar. Operating within the Ming and Qing courts, these Jesuits offered astronomical expertise in exchange for imperial favor. They helped correct the Chinese lunisolar calendar, recalculated eclipse predictions, and introduced European instruments and methods. While these activities were presented as scientific collaboration, they also served as a strategic mechanism to align Chinese timekeeping with Western chronology. The result was a gradual subordination of Chinese temporal sovereignty to European models. The fact that this occurred under the guise of empirical progress only heightened its potency. In Latin America, Jesuit missions actively rewrote indigenous temporal systems. Mesoamerican calendars, which had operated independently of European models for centuries, were dismissed as pagan or irrational. Indigenous histories were systematically translated, edited, or destroyed, with only fragments surviving under the editorial control of missionary scholars. These remnants were then reinterpreted through biblical and Gregorian frameworks, aligning native origin myths with Old Testament events or Christian festivals. This process was not merely cultural, it was chronological re-engineering. The pasts of entire civilizations were recalibrated to fit into a timeline that affirmed European supremacy and ecclesiastical centrality. The same strategy applied in Africa, where Jesuit missionaries played a central role in recording oral traditions, converting them into written chronicles, and inserting them into the dominant historical framework. Local rulers and events were dated according to the Christian calendar. Ancestral lineages were aligned with biblical genealogies. The result was a temporal absorption of peripheral histories into the Western core. By controlling how time was recorded, taught, and institutionalized, the Jesuits established a global regime of synchronized chronology that masked the plurality of temporal traditions. This synchronization was not neutral. It served several overlapping functions: religious conversion, imperial administration, and epistemic dominance. By engineering a chronology that unified the Christian world and subordinated other timelines, the Jesuits advanced the Counter-Reformation strategic goals. Protestantism, with its fragmented views on doctrine and history, posed a threat to Catholic universality. A unified Catholic chronology served to reassert coherence, authority, and legitimacy. This coherence extended beyond theology. It stabilized narratives of state formation, royal lineage, and divine order. Jesuit historiography reflected this ambition. Historical works produced by Jesuits, such as Martino Martini's Synecdoche Historiadicus or Athanasius Kircher's Universal Histories, sought to show that all civilizations ultimately led to or converged with Christianity. These works embedded global events into a timeline that was not only linear and cumulative, but centered on the Incarnation and the papal institution. The spread of Christianity was thus not one historical development among many, it was the axis upon which all time turned. The techniques used to create this structure were methodical. Jesuits produced extensive historical tables, chronologies, and universal histories in which parallel columns listed events across different cultures for each year or decade. These tables gave the illusion of simultaneity, even when the data used to construct them was inconsistent or speculative. The effort to align reigns, battles, and cultural milestones across Europe, Asia, and Africa was presented as a scientific achievement. In reality, it was an ideological act, an attempt to impose order, coherence, and centrality on an unruly and uneven historical record. Perhaps most crucially, the Jesuits' work in astronomy provided the tools to anchor these synchronisms. Observatories in Paris, Beijing, Goa, and Lima collected data that was interpreted through the Gregorian framework. Celestial events were used to fix dates, which then served as reference points for other civilizations' histories. The alignment of solar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and comet sightings became a new form of temporal authority, one that claimed empirical objectivity but operated within a constructed epistemology. Resistance to Jesuit temporal engineering did exist. Local scholars in China, Brahmins in India, and indigenous scribes in the Americas often challenged the erasure of their own calendars and chronologies. But the global reach of the Jesuit network, combined with its alliance with colonial powers and papal authority, ensured that alternative temporalities were marginalized. Jesuit institutions became the global default for historical instruction, and their chronological framework became embedded in the structures of colonial administration, education, and ecclesiastical governance. That the legacy of this engineering endures. The global historical timeline taught today, its division into ancient, medieval, and modern periods, its centrality of Europe, its dating of global events relative to Christian epochs, owes much to Jesuit synchronization. This timeline is not merely the product of discovery or accumulation, it is the artifact of a deliberate, coordinated program of temporal control. Having explored how the Jesuits extended the Western chronological framework globally, the next section will examine the imposition of calendar systems in colonial contexts more broadly. What does it mean to erase indigenous calendars and replace them with imported ones? How did colonial powers use calendar reform not just as an administrative tool, but as a means of epistemic conquest? The colonial project was not limited to territorial conquest, economic exploitation, or religious conversion. It was also a profound reconfiguration of time. In the process of asserting control over distant lands and populations, European empires did not merely bring new languages, technologies, or institutions. They brought new calendars, new chronologies, and new historical narratives. These temporal impositions were not benign tools for coordination. They were acts of epistemic domination designed to overwrite indigenous understandings of time, erase cyclical or ancestral frameworks, and replace them with linear, European models anchored in Christian eschatology and imperial administration. Colonial powers viewed indigenous timekeeping systems as impediments to governance, trade, and ideological conformity. Where native populations organized their lives according to lunar cycles, seasonal rituals, or mythic cosmogonies, colonial administrators saw disorder, irrationality, and backwardness. The first step in the temporal conquest was thus discursive. Non-European calendars were delegitimized, described as primitive or superstitious, and excluded from official records. This discursive marginalization justified their replacement with imported systems, typically the Gregorian calendar, already re-engineered by the Jesuit network and sanctioned by the Catholic Church. In the Americas, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers systematically dismantled native calendars. The Aztec Tonalpohualli and Xupohualli, as well as the Maya Tzolk'in and Hab, were treated as relics of idolatry. Spanish friars burned codices, destroyed ritual centers, and replaced indigenous festivals with Christian feast days. The alignment of native calendars with celestial events, a sophisticated science in Mesoamerican cultures, was rendered invisible, and temporal authority was transferred to ecclesiastical authorities. The imposition of the Gregorian calendar was not merely a religious maneuver, it was the elimination of an entire cosmological order. Time itself was Christianized. The process was not limited to surface synchronization. Missionaries often reinterpreted native myths to fit biblical timelines. Creation stories were edited to resemble Genesis. Ancestral heroes were reframed as analogs of Christian saints. Even the age of civilizations was manipulated. Indigenous claims to deep antiquity were dismissed, shortened, or ignored. Civilizations that claimed to be tens of thousands of years old were declared to be no older than the flood. These revisions forced native histories into the narrow chronological window permitted by biblical genealogies and Gregorian calibration. In Africa, a similar strategy was deployed. Pre-colonial African societies operated with diverse temporal systems, some based on lunar calendars, others on agricultural cycles, ancestral lineages, or complex rituals of time reckoning involving divination and collective memory. These systems were often non-linear, with time perceived as an event-driven rather than clock-driven phenomenon. The introduction of European timekeeping first through missionary schools, then colonial administration, displaced these indigenous frameworks. Time became regimented, quantified, and detached from the land and the cosmos. The week, the month, the fiscal year, all foreign constructs, became embedded in governance, labor, and education. Colonial education was central to this transformation. Mission schools taught students not only Christian doctrine but also Gregorian dates, the lives of European monarchs, and the temporal structure of European history. Students learned that their own ancestors lived in prehistory, that their societies were timeless, and that modernity began with European arrival. Calendars, once community artifacts tied to local meaning, were reduced to printed grids hung in classrooms and offices, bearing holidays of foreign saints and national figures. This was not just cultural replacement, it was ontological realignment. In India, British colonial rule brought about a particularly aggressive form of chronological rationalization. While Indian historical traditions had long embraced cyclical conceptions of time yugas, kalpas, and the vast cosmic timescales of Hindu cosmology, the British imposed a linear historiography centered on dynasties, invasions, and colonial milestones. Ancient texts were translated and reordered to fit the framework of Western chronology. Sanskrit epics were assigned speculative dates based on biblical synchronisms, and temple inscriptions were interpreted through European dating systems. The British introduced the Gregorian calendar as the official temporal standard, aligning Indian administrative and legal systems with imperial time. This imposition was not without resistance. Local scholars, pundits, and mystics objected to the rewriting of their histories, the flattening of their cosmologies, and the erasure of ancestral knowledge. But the colonial apparatus was comprehensive. Printing presses, school syllabi, administrative records, and religious reforms all operated within the imposed temporal framework. Even anti-colonial movements, while challenging imperial authority, often failed to question the imported chronological structure within which they articulated their claims. The colonial reordering of time extended to labor and industry. Indigenous forms of work, often embedded in seasonal or communal rhythms, were replaced by wage labor regulated by the clock. Plantation economies operated on time schedules dictated by metropolitan finance. Railroads, post offices, and telegraphs synchronized. Colonies to European capitals. The imposition of time zones, established in the 19th century as part of global standardization, reinforced this dependence. Local noon no longer mattered. The empire dictated what time it was. Calendar reform, often framed as administrative efficiency, was in practice a tool of temporal governance. It enabled surveillance, taxation, scheduling, and coordination, but also disorientation, cultural amnesia, and submission. In many colonies, the first official act of conquest was the recalibration of time. Calendars were revised, festivals rescheduled, and historical memory severed. Native cosmologies were overwritten not by direct denial, but by systemic substitution. Over time, even the descendants of the colonized began to forget that another order of time had ever existed. These practices reveal the centrality of time in the logic of empire. Time was not merely a backdrop to colonial activity, it was one of its primary targets. Control over time meant control over history, labor, belief, and identity. The colonizer's calendar became the colonized subject's calendar. What had once been sacred, communal, or mythic was rendered bureaucratic, standardized, and distant. The consequences of this transformation persist. Across the post-colonial world, the Gregorian calendar remains the official structure of time. National histories are still narrated according to European epochs. Sacred dates tied to indigenous memory often go unrecognized by state institutions, and the metaphysical implications of the temporal conquest remain largely unexamined. While post-colonial theory has critiqued language, race, and economics, the conquest of time continues to operate beneath the surface. Having established that the imposition of time served colonial power, the investigation must now turn to the presumed objectivity of modern scientific chronology. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and stratigraphy are often treated as independent correctives to historical uncertainty. But do these methods truly escape the distortions of earlier chronological engineering, or are they calibrated by the very timelines they claim to verify? The 20th century brought an apparent revolution in historical dating. Where once chronology was dependent on manuscript traditions, genealogical estimates, or ecclesiastical authority, new scientific methods promised objective, material verification. Among the most prominent were radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, thermoluminescence, and stratigraphic layering. These techniques, grounded in physics and biology, offered the prospect of breaking free from theological scaffolding and recalibrating human history based on empirical evidence. Yet the deeper one investigates the methodological foundations of these tools, the more evident it becomes that their objectivity is often overstated. Scientific dating methods do not operate in isolation from historical assumptions. They rely on them, calibrate against them, and in some cases reinforce the very chronological frameworks they are thought to supersede. Radiocarbon dating, developed by Willard Libby in the late 1940s, is based on the predictable decay of carbon-14 isotopes in organic material. In theory, the method allows archaeologists to determine the age of formerly living things within a range of several tens of thousands of years. However, radiocarbon dates must be calibrated because the concentration of atmospheric carbon-14 has not remained constant over time. Calibration requires matching radiocarbon dates with dendrochronological sequences, tree ring records that provide year-by-year dating. But here arises a critical dependency. Dendrochronological sequences themselves are anchored using historical chronologies. In Europe, these anchors are drawn from wood samples dated by historical records documents, coins, or architectural attribution. If those historical reference points are incorrect or artificially extended, then the calibration curve for radiocarbon dating becomes compromised. This issue becomes especially problematic when applied to the early medieval period. Because of the documentary gaps and contested chronology surrounding the so-called Dark Ages, roughly 614 to 911 CE, radiocarbon calibration during this interval is particularly sensitive to assumptions. In practice, laboratories tend to normalize Unexpected results: dates that deviate significantly from the expected historical range are often explained away as contamination, measurement error, or context misinterpretation. The circularity is subtle but consequential. Historical timelines inform expected ranges, and those ranges influence the acceptance or rejection of radiocarbon results. Rather than challenging history, the method becomes a tool for confirming it. Dendrochronology, often considered the gold standard for year-precise dating, is not immune to similar concerns. Tree ring sequences are regional and depend on continuous, overlapping samples. Establishing these sequences over millennia involves splicing together samples from living trees, historical buildings, and buried wood. Yet gaps exist, particularly in earlier periods, and in some regions continuous sequences are unavailable. Even when they are, the matching of ring patterns across samples involves interpretive choices, statistical correlation thresholds, growth variability, and cross-dating. Assumptions. The anchoring of these sequences to absolute dates again depends on historically attested benchmarks. Without a fixed point provided by chronologically dated artifacts, the entire sequence floats unmored. Other dating methods fare no better. Thermoluminescence, used to date ceramics, requires knowledge of the last time the object was heated, a variable difficult to confirm. Stratigraphy, the study of sediment layers, assumes continuous deposition and undisturbed layers, yet archaeological sites are frequently altered by natural events, human intervention, or excavation errors. These limitations are not minor technicalities, they are foundational to the method's reliability. In many cases, absolute dating methods merely provide ranges that are then narrowed using historical expectation. The result is a feedback loop where history and science reinforce each other's assumptions rather than providing independent verification. This interdependency is rarely acknowledged in public discourse. Textbooks, documentaries, and popular science articles present scientific dating as definitive. Archaeological sites are described as carbon dated to precise centuries, reinforcing the illusion of exactitude. When deviations occur, dates that fall outside the accepted historical window, they are quietly adjusted, dismissed, or left unreported. The authority of scientific chronology is preserved not by transparency, but by interpretive flexibility masked as precision. The problem deepens when considering how these methods have been used to support ideological narratives. During the height of colonial archaeology, scientific dating was applied selectively to affirm the antiquity of European civilizations, while compressing the timelines of colonized cultures. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece were emphasized as pillars of Western heritage, with carefully calibrated chronologies aligned to the biblical timeline or Greco-Roman dating. By contrast, African, American, and Asian sites were often assigned vague or reduced temporal depth. Scientific methods were not immune from the cultural biases that shaped historical interpretation, they were embedded within them. Even more troubling is the tendency to treat laboratory results as neutral outputs, divorced from the institutional and funding structures that govern their production. Radiocarbon laboratories are not epistemological vacuums. They operate under academic, governmental, or corporate patronage. Their methodologies are shaped by peer-reviewed expectations, publication pressures, and disciplinary orthodoxy. Results that conform to established timelines are more likely to be published, cited, and funded. Dissenting chronologies, anomalous datasets, or contradictory findings are marginalized or dismissed. The authority of science in this domain is often sustained by institutional consensus rather than falsifiable rigor. This does not mean that radiocarbon or dendrochronology are inherently flawed or fraudulent. They are powerful tools capable of narrowing possibilities and revealing long-term patterns. But their claims to independence from historical chronology are overstated. In practice, they operate as collaborative components in a larger system of historical construction. That system, as shown in earlier sections, is rooted in theological timelines, papal decrees, institutional biases, and colonial impositions. Scientific dating methods, rather than offering escape from these structures, often function as their epistemic reinforcement. The consequences are profound. When anomalies are dismissed and calibrations are guided by potentially flawed historical anchors, entire epochs may be preserved or rejected based on circular reasoning. If, for instance, a site produces carbon dates that suggest occupation in a phantom period, and those dates are calibrated against a curve informed by the very chronology under question, the result is not empirical confirmation, it is methodological entrapment. The tools of verification become the agents of repetition. The broader implication is that scientific chronology, far from being the bedrock of historical knowledge, may be a secondary layer built atop a foundational architecture shaped by narrative, ideology, and institutional authority. Its precision is real, but its orientation is inherited. The numbers produced are accurate within a system of assumptions that may not be. This realization demands not the abandonment of scientific methods, but their recontextualization. They must be understood as tools within a historiographical framework, not arbiters above it. The next phase of this investigation will explore the implications of calendar systems themselves as political technologies. Beyond their use in science or administration, calendars shape identity, governance, and legitimacy. What happens when the system of timekeeping itself becomes an instrument of power? How do states, churches, and empires use calendars not to reflect time, but to command it? Calendars are often assumed to be passive instruments, tools to mark days, organize events, and synchronize communal activity. Yet history reveals that calendar systems have functioned as far more than neutral frameworks. They are instruments of power, technologies for administering populations, enforcing ideological conformity, asserting temporal sovereignty, and shaping collective memory. From ancient empires to modern nation-states, the implementation, maintenance, and reform of calendar systems have consistently served political objectives. Far from being peripheral to governance, timekeeping lies at the heart of how power legitimizes itself across generations. The act of defining a calendar is fundamentally an act of selection. It determines when the year begins, what days are deemed sacred, how weeks are structured, and which events are remembered or forgotten. These decisions do not emerge from consensus or natural cycles alone. They are imposed through institutional force. The choice to begin a calendar from a specific founding event, whether the birth of Christ, the Hijra of Muhammad, the founding of Rome, Abiyarb Candida, or the reign of a monarch, is a political act. It tells the population not only what time it is, but what matters in time. Historically, control over calendars has been monopolized by ruling institutions. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs linked their authority to celestial rhythms, with the heliacal rising of Sirius marking the new year. The Sumerians and Babylonians used lunar calendars tied to temple rituals, ensuring that religious institutions govern both time and cosmic order. In Rome, the Pontifex Maximus held the power to insert intercalary months, thereby extending or shortening political terms, an overt fusion of temporal and political manipulation. These early examples show that calendar systems were never mere reflections of the cosmos. They were mechanisms of influence. The shift to Christian time in the Roman Empire illustrates the capacity of calendar reform to signal ideological transformation. Constantine's endorsement of Christianity, followed by Theodosius's declaration of it as the state religion, ushered in not only theological changes but calendrical ones. Pagan festivals were replaced by Christian ones, and the Roman calendar was restructured to reflect the new religious orthodoxy. The liturgical calendar became a tool of Christianization, embedding theological narratives into the annual cycle. The year no longer revolved around imperial milestones, it became structured around Advent, Lent, Easter, and Saints' days. The spiritualization of time served the Church's need to dominate not only belief, but rhythm. This logic was fully realized in the Gregorian reform of 1582, which not only corrected astronomical drift, but reasserted papal supremacy. The reform was a top-down imposition of a new temporal order. Its adoption was delayed in Protestant territories, not because of disagreement over leap years, but because it symbolized Roman Catholic authority. For many, to accept the Gregorian calendar was to submit to the Pope's jurisdiction over time itself. The schism over calendar adoption underscores the reality that timekeeping is not universally neutral, it is contested terrain. Intimately tied to questions of sovereignty and identity. In modern nation-states, calendars have continued to serve as instruments of statecraft. Revolutionary France famously abandoned the Gregorian calendar in favor of the French Republican calendar, which divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, abolished religious holidays, and renamed days after natural phenomena. The reform was explicitly anti-clerical and rationalist, intended to sever ties with the Ancien regime and the Church. The Republican calendar failed to gain lasting traction, but it demonstrated how deeply the calendar is entwined with political symbolism. A new regime requires a new reckoning of time. Similarly, the Soviet Union attempted to reshape time as part of its broader ideological revolution. The Bolsheviks initially adopted the Gregorian calendar to align with international socialism, but soon experimented with further reforms. The Soviet calendar introduced continuous work weeks and secular holidays to undermine religious observance. Although the reforms were eventually abandoned, they illustrate the logic of revolutionary calendrical engineering. To remake society, one must remake time. In colonial contexts, as explored in previous sections, the imposition of foreign calendars was a key strategy for displacing indigenous sovereignty. Colonizers did not merely administer people, they administered time. The Gregorian calendar became a universal standard, not because it was astronomically superior, but because it was institutionally enforced. Timekeeping served as a vector of assimilation. The recognition of official holidays, the standardization of the fiscal year, and the synchronization of administrative schedules all helped integrate colonized populations into the temporal regime of empire. Beyond political and religious domains, calendars also regulate economic life. Fiscal years, tax cycles, work schedules, and market rhythms are all embedded in calendrical structures. Time becomes quantifiable, extractable, and manageable. The weekend, the quarter, the annual review, these are not natural divisions, but institutional inventions. Their regularity masks their constructed nature. In capitalist societies, the commodification of time depends on standardized calendars to enable contracts, deadlines, and debt schedules. Time is not merely lived, it is owned, leased, and monetized. National holidays offer another layer of calendrical control. By designating specific days as commemorative Independence Days, founding dates, victories, the state inscribes its narrative into the yearly cycle. These moments are not neutral reflections of history. They are curated events, chosen to foster loyalty, identity, and cohesion. What is remembered is what reinforces legitimacy. What is excluded is what threatens coherence. The calendar thus becomes a form of state-sponsored memory, enforced not only through celebration but also through erasure. The symbolic weight of calendar reform extends into international politics. The adoption of the Gregorian calendar as the global standard did not occur uniformly or organically. It was facilitated by colonial networks, missionary education, international treaties, and technological synchronization. Today's global time infrastructure coordinated through Universal Coordinated Time, UTC, atomic clocks and digital protocols rests atop this inherited structure. The appearance of universality conceals its historical contingency. Even resistance to calendar systems tends to confirm their power. Alternative communities, religious sects, indigenous groups, or countercultural movements often assert autonomy by observing their own calendars. The Hebrew, Islamic, and Chinese calendars continue to be used in religious contexts, sustaining identities distinct from the Gregorian mainstream. These parallel systems reveal that the calendar is not just a convenience, but a marker of allegiance. The implications for historiography are substantial. When history is periodized according to calendrical epoch centuries, decades, millennia, it adopts the logic of the dominant timekeeping system. The 9th century or the Middle Ages are not merely descriptive terms. They are temporal containers shaped by institutional agendas. Historical transitions, renaissances, and collapses are interpreted through the lens of these divisions. The calendar becomes the syntax of historical narrative. Thus, calendar systems are not neutral grids onto which events are mapped. They are frameworks that determine what counts as an event, how sequences are interpreted, and whose time is considered normative. They enforce continuity where none may exist and impose divisions where continuity prevails. They turn duration into discipline. The next section will explore specific examples of resistance to this imposed uniformity. While many societies eventually adopted the Gregorian calendar under pressure or necessity, others resisted for centuries. Orthodox Christian nations, revolutionary governments, and even scientific institutions have at times refused the hegemony of Rome's calendar. What can be learned from their resistance, and what does their eventual capitulation reveal about the nature of temporal power? The Gregorian calendar, while now a global standard, was not accepted immediately nor universally. Its adoption unfolded over centuries, marked by conflict, suspicion, and outright rejection. The calendar's ecclesiastical origins, introduced via papal bull in 1582, made it a politically and theologically charged instrument. Resistance to its adoption reveals not only religious and cultural divergences, but the deep entanglement of timekeeping with authority, sovereignty, and ideological allegiance. In this context, resistance to the Gregorian calendar was never simply a matter of astronomical disagreement. It was a struggle over who controls time, and by extension, the shape of collective reality. The most immediate opposition came from Protestant Europe. The calendar reform initiated by Pope Gregory XIII was viewed not as a scientific correction, but as a papal intrusion into sovereign and spiritual affairs. England, under Queen Elizabeth I, rejected the reform outright. Protestant theologians and parliamentarians argued that accepting a calendar issued by the Bishop of Rome would signify a symbolic surrender to Catholic authority, reversing the Reformation's break from papal influence. As a result, England and its colonies continued using the Julian calendar for nearly 170 years after the Gregorian reform was enacted. This divergence created significant problems in diplomacy, commerce, and communication. English dates lagged 10, later 11 days behind those of Catholic Europe, leading to confusion in the coordination of treaties, correspondence, and trade. Events shared across nations were recorded on different days, depending on the calendar in use. To address this, English documents sometimes labeled dates with the abbreviation OS. Old Style, or NS. New Style, a tacit acknowledgement of temporal bifurcation. The coexistence of two calendar systems within the same geopolitical space exposed the fragility of temporal uniformity and underscored that timekeeping is not merely technical, but ideological. It was not until the Calendar New Style Act of 1750 that Britain and its colonies formally adopted the Gregorian calendar. The adjustment required dropping 11 days from the calendar in September 1752, moving directly from September 2nd to September 14th. The disruption sparked confusion and popular resentment, leading to myths of mass protest under the slogan, "Give US back our 11 days." Although no credible evidence supports large-scale riots, the public unease reveals how intimately people experience time as a component of lived reality. To remove days was to disturb the moral and psychological order. Orthodox Christian world also resisted Gregorian reform. The Eastern Orthodox Church, already divided from the Roman Church since the Great Schism of 1054, viewed the calendar reform as an extension of Latin theological dominance. The Julian calendar remained in use for religious purposes in Russia, Greece, Serbia, and other Orthodox nations. While some of these countries adopted the Gregorian calendar for civil use in the 20th century Russia, in 1918, Greece in 1923, the liturgical calendar remains Julian in many Orthodox communities to this day. Easter, for example, is still celebrated according to Julian reckoning in many Eastern churches, leading to divergences of 1 or more weeks from Western observance. This bifurcation persists not out of ignorance or inertia, but as a deliberate assertion of theological and cultural autonomy. The Julian calendar is treated by many Orthodox believers not as outdated, but as spiritually legitimate and cosmically ordained. Resistance to the Gregorian calendar is thus a refusal to submit to Western ecclesiastical and historical authority. It reflects a larger conflict over the custody of sacred time and the interpretation of sacred history. In the Orthodox view, adopting the Gregorian calendar would sever a direct connection to the apostolic and patristic pastor rupture that is both doctrinal and ontological. Beyond the Christian sphere, Islamic societies presented a different kind of resistance. The Islamic calendar, being lunar and independent of solar correction, operates on fundamentally different principles. It is not synchronized with the Gregorian calendar and does not require reform because it does not aim to align with the solar year. Islamic time is structured around ritual, lunar observation, and theological symbolism. Attempts by colonial or secular regimes to impose the Gregorian calendar in Muslim-majority regions were often met with suspicion or rejection. In some cases, parallel calendars were maintained, one for religious observance and another for civil administration. Modern Turkey, under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1926 as part of a sweeping program of secular modernization. The reform was not astronomical but ideological. It aimed to align the Turkish Republic with Western modernity and break with the Ottoman Islamic past. In this context, calendar adoption became a symbol of national transformation, a tool for constructing a new identity. Yet even in Turkey, religious festivals continue to be observed according to the Islamic calendar, demonstrating the persistence of alternative temporalities. Revolutionary movements have also attempted to overthrow or replace dominant calendar systems. The French Republican calendar, introduced in 1793, was designed to erase the Gregorian calendar's religious and monarchical associations. It divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, with 5 or 6 supplementary days to complete the solar year. Each week consisted of 10 days, decades, reducing the frequency of religious rest days and promoting secular labor. Days were named after agricultural products and natural phenomena rather than saints. This reform was part of a broader attempt to create a rational, Enlightenment-based society, a utopia built on re-engineered time. Despite its rigor, the Republican calendar never gained deep public traction. It was difficult to use, detached from the rhythms of agricultural and social life, and lacked institutional continuity. It was abolished in 1806 by Napoleon, who restored the Gregorian calendar to consolidate political order. Yet its brief existence demonstrates that calendars can be reimagined when ideological will is strong enough. It also shows the limits of Such reimaginings, when they fail to anchor themselves in collective experience. In the Soviet Union, efforts to revise the calendar reflected similar ambitions. Between 1929 and 1940, the Soviet regime experimented with various calendar reforms, including the implementation of continuous labor weeks, secular holidays, and the suppression of religious observances. These changes aimed to sever ties with the Orthodox Church and create a society oriented toward industrial production and socialist celebration. But the reforms disrupted social cohesion, undermined morale, and proved logistically unworkable. They were eventually reversed, and the Gregorian calendar was reinstated for both civil and state functions. The episode revealed that even totalitarian regimes face limits in reshaping temporal consciousness. What unites these diverse resistances, religious, national, revolutionary, is the recognition that calendars are not mere instruments of measurement. They are structures of meaning, binding individuals to institutions, traditions, and cosmologies. To reject the calendar is to reject the authority behind it. To impose one is to assert dominance over history, ritual, and identity. The persistence of resistance, even amid overwhelming institutional pressure, affirms that timekeeping is contested ground. In the contemporary world, the Gregorian calendar reigns supreme, but not without remnants of dissent. Liturgical calendars, lunar observances, and cultural timeframes continue to operate alongside the global standard. These parallel systems resist full absorption. Their survival suggests that time remains a plural and contested domain. In the next section, the investigation will turn to the mechanisms by which the Gregorian calendar was globalized. Specifically, how was it standardized not only across nations, but across technologies? The emergence of time zones, Greenwich Mean Time, and later Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, did not occur spontaneously. They were the result of institutional consolidation. What were the forces behind this final conquest of time? The global dominance of the Gregorian calendar did not emerge solely from papal decree or colonial administration. It required technological consolidation, institutional authority, and the transformation of time from a local, cultural phenomenon into an international infrastructure. This process culminated in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the establishment of time zones, the designation of Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, and later Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, completed the transition from temporal pluralism to near total synchronization. Behind the veneer of coordination lay a matrix of geopolitical decisions, scientific conventions, and commercial imperatives. Time became uniform not by nature, but by design. Prior to the industrial age, time was a local affair. Communities set their clocks by the position of the sun, usually marking noon when the sun reached its zenith. This meant that each town effectively operated on its own solar time. While manageable in pre-industrial societies, this system collapsed under the pressures of modern transportation and communication. The expansion of railroads in the 19th century exposed the inadequacy of local timekeeping. Trains could not operate on schedules if every town maintained its own version of noon. Timetables became incoherent. The Industrial Revolution demanded a new regime, one of temporal centralization. Britain led this transformation. With the spread of its railway network, the need for a standardized time system became urgent. In 1847, British railway companies adopted Greenwich Mean Time as the standard across their schedules, effectively exporting London's time to the rest of the country. Over the next decades, public clocks, newspapers, and government services followed suit. By 1880, GMT became the legal time throughout the United Kingdom. The decision to anchor national time to Greenwich Observatory was not just logistical, it was symbolic. It established Britain's scientific and imperial authority as the temporal reference for the modern world. This authority was institutionalized globally at the International Meridian Conference held in Washington, D.C. in 1884. Delegates from 25 nations gathered to address the chaotic state of global timekeeping. The conference selected the Greenwich meridian as the prime meridian 0 degrees longitude against which all global time would be measured. It divided the world into 24 time zones, each spanning 15 degrees of longitude and differing by 1 hour. The decision effectively exported British time as a universal baseline. Though cloaked in the language of internationalism, the designation of Greenwich was a geopolitical assertion of dominance by the British Empire. Not all countries accepted this system immediately. France, which had used the Paris meridian for centuries, refused to adopt GMT for several decades. Other nations resisted the perceived Anglo-centric imposition. Nevertheless, the system gained traction through its association with trade, navigation, and telecommunication. Standardized time became embedded in the protocols of international shipping, aviation, and banking. Over time, resistance faded under the weight of infrastructural necessity. The clock of Greenwich ticked not because it was the most rational or natural, but because it became indispensable. The next major transformation came with the invention of atomic timekeeping in the mid-20th century. Atomic clocks, based on the vibration of cesium atoms, offered unprecedented accuracy, free from the irregularities of Earth's rotation. This led to the establishment of Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, in 1960, a system that combined atomic precision with astronomical reference points. UTC preserved GMT as a legacy concept, but moved the functional basis of time into the realm of quantum physics. Leap seconds were introduced to reconcile atomic time with Earth's rotation. Time had been fully abstracted, detached from the observable sky, and rooted in laboratory measurement. The shift to UTC marked the culmination of time's transformation from a lived, cosmologically embedded experience to a mechanized, standardized infrastructure. Time no longer flowed from sunrises, seasons, or festivals. It flowed from machines. These machines were located in scientific institutions, controlled by international organizations, and synchronized via satellites and optical fibers. The International Bureau of Weights and Measures, BITME, in Paris became the custodian of global time, issuing authoritative bulletins that dictated when a second began or ended. Civil time, once communal, became centralized and non-negotiable. This infrastructure now undergirds every aspect of modern life. GPS systems rely on atomic time synchronization. Financial markets execute trades based on microsecond precision. International data centers coordinate backups, security protocols, and traffic management through Network Time Protocol (NTP) servers. Aircraft, ships, military operations, and digital communication all depend on an invisible lattice of standardized time. Disruption to this lattice, whether through technical failure or geopolitical interference, has immediate global consequences. Importantly, this standardization has flattened cultural diversity in timekeeping. Traditional calendars persist, but they exist in the shadow of the Gregorian UTC regime. Lunar festivals, agricultural rites, and sacred observances are now translated into Gregorian equivalents. Public holidays, school terms, fiscal years, and even personal rituals like birthdays operate within the framework of global time. The multiplicity of temporal rhythms has been subsumed under a system that privileges uniformity over plurality, coordination over meaning, the authority to define and regulate. This global time is concentrated in a small set of institutions. The BIPM, the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, and national metrology agencies. These bodies are unelected, technocratic, and inaccessible to most of the global population. While they operate with scientific transparency, their decisions are not subject to democratic oversight. The inclusion or exclusion of leap seconds, for example, affects every device on the planet, yet the debate is confined to technical committees. Temporal sovereignty has been surrendered to experts. The standardization of time has also redefined the experience of time. The global clock imposes simultaneity where none exists. Events are scheduled across time zones, with software converting local times into UTC and back again. Yet this simultaneity is artificial. No one truly shares the same temporal experience. It is constructed through conversion tables, algorithmic translation, and interface design. The illusion of a unified now obscures the persistence of temporal fragmentation. In geopolitical terms, time zones reflect historical compromises and power dynamics. Some countries maintain half-hour or quarter-hour offsets. Others adopt time zones for political reasons. China, despite its vast geographic breadth, uses a single time zone, Beijing time, effectively enforcing political unity through temporal uniformity. North Korea has periodically shifted its time zone to assert independence. Israel, Palestine, and other conflict zones debate daylight saving time as part of territorial disputes. Time remains a site of symbolic struggle. Ultimately, the globalization of time has completed a centuries-long project, the transformation of time from a cultural and cosmic reality into a tool of governance. The Gregorian calendar, the prime meridian, atomic clocks, and UTC form a coherent system that enables global capitalism, surveillance, control, and administration. But this coherence comes at a cost. It imposes artificial order on human rhythms. It erodes local autonomy. It obscures the ideological history of how time came to be standardized. In the final stages of this investigation, it becomes necessary to ask the overarching question: who benefits from the system? Who owns the machinery of time, and who must live by its dictates? The answer lies not in the mechanics of clocks or the precision of satellites, but in the consolidation of authority behind the appearance of neutrality. The final section will confront this consolidation head-on. The transformation of time from a local, sacred, or political construct into a globalized infrastructure is often perceived as the culmination of centuries of progress. In the digital era, time appears frictionless, synchronized across devices, platforms, and continents, invisibly underpinning everything from financial transactions to messaging applications. Yet this apparent uniformity masks the operation of a deeper structure: temporal hegemony. In the contemporary world, time is not merely measured, it is administered, monetized, and weaponized by a set of concentrated entities that manage the infrastructure of synchronization. Digital time, like its ecclesiastical and colonial predecessors, is not neutral. It is a regime. In the past, papal bulls, imperial calendars, and state reforms imposed authority over time. Today, this authority has migrated to software protocols, server hierarchies, and machine-readable timestamps. The Network Time Protocol, NTP, for example, coordinates the clocks of millions of devices globally. It operates in the background, unseen by users, ensuring that computers, smartphones, and databases agree on what time it is. But the servers that provide these time signals are not equally distributed. A majority are owned and maintained by large technology corporations, national laboratories, or military institutions. The hierarchy of trust within the NTP ecosystem privileges certain sources over others. As such, the correct time is not democratically determined, it is issued from centralized nodes of power. This centralization has real consequences. Financial markets are time-sensitive ecosystems in which milliseconds can determine massive gains or losses. Stock exchanges in New York, London, and Tokyo operate on hyper-synchronized clocks. Latency is measured and manipulated to gain competitive advantage. High-frequency trading firms co-locate servers near exchange infrastructure to minimize temporal drift. Here, time becomes a weapon measured, priced, and optimized in the service of capital accumulation. This is not time as experience, But time is differential access. Cloud infrastructure extends this logic. Global platforms such as Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud host services for millions of users. Their data centers rely on synchronized time to coordinate virtual machines, logs, security protocols, and user actions. Yet users have no visibility into the architecture that structures this synchronization. The decisions about which time sources to trust, how to handle leap seconds, or how to reconcile conflicting timestamps are made unilaterally by platform engineers. This asymmetry is epistemological. Most people operate within a system of digital time they neither understand nor control. Operating systems reinforce this dependency. Whether using Windows, Mac OS, Linux, or Android, devices synchronize to preselected time servers upon boot. The selection of these servers is embedded in the software, reflecting corporate affiliations and geopolitical boundaries. The user can change them in theory, but few ever do. Time becomes part of the software stack, modular, abstract, and pre-configured. In enterprise environments, system administrators enforce synchronization policies that cascade through organizational networks. Disagreement with the official time is not dissent, it is a security risk. Digital authentication relies on time as a key variable. Encryption protocols, access tokens, session timeouts, and certificate validity all depend on precise timestamps. If a device's clock drifts, it may be locked out of secure systems or flagged as compromised. This gives time a disciplinary function. It enforces conformity under the guise of protection. The politics of time in digital networks is not overtly ideological, it is procedural. Yet the procedures embed assumptions about trust, authority, and compliance. Social platforms add another layer. The timestamp on a tweet, a message, or a post determines its relevance, its position in the feed, and its perceived freshness. Algorithms prioritize content based on recency, often reducing human interaction to temporal proximity. Breaking news, viral content, and trending topics are governed by acceleration. What happened a day ago is obsolete. This manufactured urgency shapes public perception and social behavior. Time becomes not only synchronized but compressed, creating the illusion of a perpetual present. Unmoored from historical depth, surveillance systems depend on time-stamped data to track, model, and predict behavior. Logs of location, transactions, keystrokes, and communications are indexed chronologically, enabling pattern recognition and behavioral profiling. The fidelity of these logs rests on synchronized clocks. Without temporal coherence, surveillance collapses into noise. Thus, time is not only a medium of coordination, it is the infrastructure of control. The state, the corporation, and the algorithm coalesce around temporal data. The architecture of digital time reflects the values of its architects: efficiency, scale, predictability, and control. Alternative temporalities, indigenous, ritual, seasonal, or cyclical, are incompatible with the logic of digital platforms. They cannot be encoded into ISO 8601 date formats or coordinated via UTC. As a result, they are excluded not by censorship, but by incompatibility. The monoculture of digital time displaces temporal plurality through infrastructural design. There are emerging signs of resistance, but they are fragmented. Open source time servers, decentralized timestamping via blockchain, and the reassertion of local calendar observances in cultural software represent attempts to reassert autonomy. Yet these efforts face structural challenges. Global networks are engineered to prefer uniformity. Synchronization is not just a feature, it is a requirement. To opt out is to risk marginalization, incompatibility, or disconnection. The consequences of this hegemony are not just technical, they are ontological. Human perception of time, already transformed by industrialization and media, is now shaped by digital infrastructure. Notifications, refresh rates, uptime, and lag become part of temporal experience. We speak of real time as a standard, forgetting that it is an engineered condition. The digital age has redefined what counts as presence, urgency, and memory. This redefinition is not neutral. It privileges certain actors and certain modes of being. Tech companies become custodians of time. Users become participants in synchronized ecosystems they do not govern. The old ecclesiastical calendar dictated sacred time from Rome. The new digital calendar is dictated from data centers. Leap seconds, once debated by astronomers, are now debated by protocol engineers and telecom corporations. The authority has shifted, but the structure remains. Time is issued, not discovered. The fiction that digital time is objective must be critically interrogated. Behind every timestamp lies a choice of server, protocol, format, and trust model. These choices reflect hierarchies. Temporal hegemony persists because it is hidden in abstraction. No longer enforced by papal bulls or imperial edicts, it is embedded in code, standards, and hardware. But its effects are no less profound. As the investigation reaches its final section, one central question remains: who owns the clock? The answer is not metaphorical, it is institutional, economic, and architectural. Time, in the digital age, is a privatized infrastructure. To understand it is to confront not only its mechanisms, but its owners. In the conclusion, this question will be addressed directly, not with abstraction, but with specificity. Across the preceding investigations, a persistent truth has emerged. Time is not neutral. It is engineered, curated, enforced, and above all, owned. From the ecclesiastical interventions of the medieval papacy to the synchronization regimes of modern digital infrastructure, time has been governed by institutions with interests religious, political, economic, or technological. The modern world runs not on natural rhythms, but on systems of time constructed through centuries of consolidation. In this final analysis, we confront the question left implicit throughout: who owns the clock? Ownership of time begins with the control of its measurement. In antiquity, this meant dominion over calendars, tools for predicting seasons, organizing festivals, and asserting imperial or religious legitimacy. The priesthoods of Mesopotamia, the astronomers of Egypt, the pontifices of Rome, each institution grounded its authority in the interpretation and dissemination of time. The Church, especially after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, inherited and concentrated this authority. By the High Middle Ages, the papacy had the exclusive power to declare feast days, to reform calendars, and to set the dates of holy observances. Papal bulls were not merely liturgical documents. They were temporal declarations, yet this ecclesiastical dominion did not last unchallenged. The Protestant Reformation fractured theological consensus, and with it, the authority to define time. Calendar reform became a site of contestation. The Gregorian calendar's rollout met resistance across Northern Europe, not just because of its Roman origins, but because it symbolized papal intrusion into civic time. Still, the calendar prevailed. It was embedded in colonial administration, missionary education, and commercial systems. Timekeeping became a function of empire. By the 19th century, with industrialization and transcontinental infrastructure, the locus of temporal control shifted again. It moved from churches to states, and then from states to technical institutions. Railways required synchronized timetables. Telegraph networks demanded consistent time zones. Global trade, insurance, and finance could not operate on local solar noon. The 1884 International Meridian Conference was a watershed. Greenwich was selected not because of geographical neutrality, but because of British naval dominance. The global clock was set in motion by maritime empire. In the 20th century, standardization accelerated. Atomic clocks and global positioning systems displaced astronomical observation. The Bureau International des Poids et Mesures (BP) in Paris became the arbiter of Coordinated Universal Time (UTC), relying on contributions from national laboratories. While ostensibly international, the system functioned through elite consensus. A handful of developed nations, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and France provided the technical basis for the world's time. The leap second, introduced to reconcile atomic time with Earth's irregular rotation, became a symbol of this control. Its inclusion or removal was debated not by democratic process, but by expert committee. Today, ownership of the clock is fragmented but no less centralized. At the state level, time remains a sovereign concern. Legislation sets time zones, daylight saving policies, and official calendars. But operational control has largely migrated to corporations and infrastructure providers. The vast majority of internet-connected devices synchronize to Network Time Protocol (NTP). Servers operated by major technology firms, Google, Microsoft, Cloudflare, Amazon, or academic institutions under government contract. These servers determine the default clock for billions of phones, laptops, servers, and IoT devices. The implications are structural. A user may reside in a sovereign state, but their device may rely on time signals issued by a corporation headquartered across the world. Software updates, authentication protocols, financial transactions, and sensor logs are all time-stamped according to remote, opaque systems. A single misconfiguration in a centralized time server can disrupt entire sectors, from air traffic control to blockchain consensus. The reliance on digital synchronization means that time is no longer a commons, it is a service. This privatization is invisible to most. It does not announce itself with ritual or ceremony. There is no decree or proclamation, only server logs and configuration files. Yet the effects are real. Time, like bandwidth or electricity, has become an infrastructural dependency. The user does not own it, understand it, or negotiate it. They receive it streamed invisibly, authoritative and absolute, and this stream is mediated by code. Time in the digital realm is formatted and coded and parsed by software libraries maintained by engineers. The format's ISO 8601 Unix time. NTP packet headers are standards developed by technical committees, consortia, or corporations. Time is now a specification. It is interoperable, modular, and programmable. But in becoming so, it has ceased to be transparent. The ownership of the clock now intersects with data, identity, and control. Every action in a digital environment is time-stamped. These timestamps form the backbone of surveillance, behavioral profiling, and forensic analysis. Who logged in? From where? At what time? Who sent the message? When did the device last connect? These questions are answerable only through time infrastructure. Whoever owns the clock, in this sense, owns the record. Moreover, the clock structures value. In algorithmic trading, speed equals advantage. Nanoseconds matter. Data centers pay premiums for proximity to time sources. Blockchain networks use time-stamping to determine consensus. Time is monetized, not abstractly, but literally. It is leased, optimized, commodified. Yet despite this consolidation, there is no public conversation about the politics of time. Regulatory frameworks focus on telecommunications, privacy, or cybersecurity, but rarely on temporal sovereignty. There is no international charter guaranteeing equitable access to time infrastructure, no debate on who should govern leap seconds, no discussion on whether atomic time reflects human needs or institutional convenience. The fiction of objectivity persists, and so the investigation returns to its original premise. Time, as experienced by contemporary civilization, is a manufactured consensus. It is upheld not by observation of the cosmos, but by compliance with institutional systems. From Scaliger's chronologies to papal reforms, from colonial calendars to atomic standards, time has always served the logic of consolidation. What appears as continuity is curation. What presents as measurement is mediation. What passes for neutrality is governance. To ask, what year is it, is to pose a political question. The answer is not found in the stars, but in the archives, in the software, in the specifications. It is a number issued by those with the power to name. Clock is not simply owned, it is enforced. And so long as it remains unquestioned, its owners remain invisible.